Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I can't believe I'm finally typing this out after all these years. My husband, Edward, passed away last spring, and I think now's as good a time as any to get this off my chest. I'm 87 years old now, and I don't have many people left who would believe me anyway. It happened on September 27th, 1970. I remember the date clearly because it was our wedding anniversary, our 32nd. Edward and I had this tradition of celebrating with a hike to see the autumn leaves. We were both retired school teachers by then, me from teaching 4th grade and Edward from high school biology. We lived just outside McGregor, Iowa, about 20 minutes from Pikes Peak State Park. That particular Sunday was absolutely gorgeous, crisp and cool with that perfect fall smell in the air. The sky was that deep autumn blue that only seems to happen in the Midwest. The leaves were just starting to turn those brilliant reds and golds. Edward had packed us a little picnic lunch, and we were planning to eat it at the overlook above the Mississippi. We arrived at the park around 10 in the morning. I remember being surprised to see only one other car in the parking lot, a blue Ford pickup that looked like it had seen better days. It wasn't unusual for the park to be quiet after Labor Day once all the kids were back in school, but it was such a beautiful day that I expected at least a few other visitors. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves, Maggie," Edward said, as he shouldered our small backpack with our lunch and water bottles. He always called me Maggie, even though everyone else called me Margaret. The ranger station was closed when we arrived, which wasn't unusual for a Sunday morning. They were often short-staffed in the off-season. We signed the trail register just in case. Edward was always cautious that way, and headed for the longest trail, our favorite one that wound through the woods before ending at that spectacular Mississippi River. Overlook. The trails at Pikes Peak are well maintained, but they're real woodland trails, dirt paths covered with leaves and pine needles, roots to step over, occasional rocks. We knew them like the back of our hands. We'd been walking these same paths for over 20 years by then, at least 3 times a week in good weather. Edward liked to joke that he could navigate them blindfolded. There's something I should explain about us. We weren't just casual hikers. After Edward retired, we became amateur naturalists of sorts. He'd bring his field guides and we'd identify plants, birds, animal tracks. We knew what lived in those woods. The white-tailed deer, red foxes, raccoons, opossums, wild turkeys. We knew their habits, their sounds. I could tell a barred owl from a great horned owl just by their calls. Edward could identify animal scat and tell you what the animal had been eating. This is important to understand because what happened that day wasn't something we could explain. We'd been hiking for about 45 minutes. The trail had been climbing gradually, and we were getting close to the overlook. The woods were incredibly quiet that day, unusually so. Normally you'd hear birds calling, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. But that day, there was nothing except the sound of dried leaves crunching beneath our boots and the occasional breeze through the treetops. "It's awfully quiet today," I remarked to Edward. He nodded, looking around. "Maybe storm coming," he suggested. But the sky was clear as could be. We were about 200 yards from the overlook when I first felt something was wrong. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Edward must have felt it too, because he slowed his pace. That's when we heard it, a rustling sound from behind a thick stand of oak trees about 30 yards off the trail to our right. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the movement seemed too deliberate, too heavy. "Edward," I whispered, clutching his arm. He patted my hand reassuringly, but I could feel the tension in his muscles. "Probably just a deer," he said. but he didn't sound convinced. We stood perfectly still, listening. The rustling stopped. For about 10 seconds, there was complete silence. Then it came, a scream that turned my blood to ice. I've spent 53 years trying to find words to describe that sound, and I still can't do it justice. It wasn't a mountain lion's scream, though it had that same piercing quality. It wasn't a bear's roar or a wolf's howl. It started low, almost like a human moan, then rose in pitch and volume until it was a shriek that seemed to fill the entire forest. It lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it ended, my ears were ringing. Edward's face had gone sheet white. In 32 years of marriage, I'd never seen him look frightened before. "What was that?" I whispered, though I'm not sure why I was whispering. Edward shook his head. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I think we should head back now." That's when we heard the heavy footsteps, something large moving through the underbrush, coming toward us. There was nothing stealthy about it. Branches were snapping, leaves were crunching. Whatever it was big, and it didn't care if we heard it. Edward grabbed my hand. "Walk, don't run," he said in a voice so calm it was almost eerie. "Just back to the car, nice and steady." We turned and began walking back down the trail, trying to maintain a normal pace. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to run. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but Edward's grip on my hand kept me moving at that maddeningly steady pace. The footsteps behind us stopped. Then that scream came again, closer this time, maybe 20 yards away. I couldn't help it. I looked back. The trees and underbrush were thick, but I caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trunks. It was tall, much taller than a person, and covered in what looked like dark fur. That's all I saw before Edward tugged me forward. "Don't look back," he said, his voice tight. "Just keep walking." We kept going, a bit faster now. The thing behind us started moving again, paralleling the trail but staying in the woods. It was keeping pace with us. Occasionally we'd hear a branch snap or leaves rustle, but it wasn't screaming anymore. Somehow that was worse, knowing it was there, following us, but not making a sound. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, we reached a bend in the trail where it started descending more steeply. Edward suddenly stopped. "We're going to make a run for it," he whispered. "When we get around that bend, the trail straightens out for about a quarter mile. We'll be able to move faster." I nodded, too terrified to speak. "Ready?" he asked, squeezing my hand. "Ready," I managed to whisper. We rounded the bend and broke into a run. I've never run so fast in my life, not even when I was a girl. The trail was slightly downhill, which helped, but it was also covered in leaves that made the footing treacherous. I slipped once and nearly fell, but Edward caught me and kept me moving. Behind us, we heard that thing crash out of the woods onto the trail. The heavy footfalls were louder now, faster. It was chasing us. "Don't look back," Edward gasped as we ran. "Just run." I don't know how long we ran, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. My lungs were burning, my legs were like rubber, but terror kept me going. Gradually, the sounds behind us faded. Either the thing had given up, or we'd managed to outpace it. We didn't slow down until we could see the parking lot through the trees. The blue pickup was gone, but our car sat there alone, a welcome sight. We stumbled the last 50 yards, and Edward fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside the car, he locked all the doors and started the engine. Neither of us spoke as he backed out of the parking space and drove toward the park exit, gravel crunching beneath the tires. I kept looking out the back window, half expecting to see that thing emerge from the woods, but there was nothing. As we approached the main gate, we saw that the ranger station was now open. A young man in a park ranger uniform was standing outside, talking to an elderly couple. "Pull over," I said to Edward. "We need to tell them what happened." Edward hesitated. then nodded and pulled the car up to the ranger station. We got out, both still breathing hard, and approached the ranger. He couldn't have been more than 25, with a fresh face and a name tag that read Ranger Mitchell. "Folks," he said, noticing our disheveled appearance, "everything okay?" Edward explained what had happened. The strange silence in the woods, the terrifying scream, the glimpse I'd caught of something large and dark. The ranger listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Ma'am, sir," he said when Edward finished, "there aren't any large predators in this park. We've got white-tailed deer, some foxes, raccoons, that sort of thing. Nothing that would make a sound like what you're describing." "We know what lives in these woods," Edward said, an edge to his voice. "We've been hiking here for 20 years. This wasn't anything we've ever encountered before." The ranger shifted uncomfortably. "Could have been a bobcat, I suppose. They can make some pretty strange sounds, especially during mating season." I shook my head. "It wasn't a bobcat. It was big, much bigger than a person. And that sound, it wasn't natural." Ranger Mitchell's expression changed slightly. Not quite a frown, but something close to it. "Well, I haven't had any other reports of unusual activity, but I'll make a note of it and have our wildlife management team check the area." It was clear he didn't believe us. To him, we were just a couple of frightened old people with overactive imaginations. We thanked him and got back in our car. For years afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go back to that part of the park. Edward went a few times with friends, but I always made excuses. The memory of that scream, that glimpse of something large and dark moving through the trees, it stayed with me. It wasn't until the early 1990s, when I was watching a documentary about Bigfoot, that I began to wonder. They played recordings of what witnesses claimed were Bigfoot vocalizations, and I felt that same ice-cold fear run down my spine. It wasn't identical to what we'd heard, but it was close. That same unnatural quality that was neither fully animal nor human. I've spent hours researching, looking for similar reports from that area, but I've never found any. Sometimes I wonder if what we encountered that day was something that just happened to be passing through, a creature so rare and elusive that Edward and I were simply in the right place at the wrong time. Edward never liked to talk about it much. "Some things don't have explanations, Maggie," he'd say when I brought it up. "Some things are just mysteries." Maybe he was right. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Something was in those woods that day, something that shouldn't have been there. And sometimes on quiet autumn nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I swear I can still hear that scream. Story 2. I still get goosebumps thinking about what I saw last summer. I've spent my entire career observing and assessing situations, 22 years as a Marine, 12 as a firefighter, and another 8 with the state police before retiring. I'm trained to notice details, to stay calm under pressure, and to trust my instincts. What I witnessed on August 16th, 2004 has challenged everything I thought I knew about our world. I was driving eastbound on Route 80 through California, heading toward Donner Pass. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon, clear skies, good visibility. Nothing unusual about the day. I remember having the windows down, enjoying the mountain air after being cooped up in the car for hours. As I approached the bridge spanning a deep ravine, something caught my eye to the south. At first, I thought it might be a hiker in dark clothing, but something about the movement seemed off. I slowed my truck down instinctively. That's when I saw it clearly. About 300 yards south of the bridge, a figure was stepping out from the tree line on the west bank of the ravine. But this was no hiker, not even close. The figure stood at least 8 feet tall. I'm not exaggerating. I've been estimating heights and distances my entire career. 8 feet minimum, with broad, distinctly humanoid shoulders. But what really made my skin crawl was that it was entirely black. Not black like African American skin, not black like someone wearing dark clothes, black like the absence of light. Completely uniformly black from head to toe. I pulled over immediately, putting my hazards on without even thinking about it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the binoculars I keep in my glove compartment. 20+ years in the Marines and law enforcement, and my hands were actually shaking. Through the binoculars, I could see the figure more clearly as it moved across the ravine. It had a strange, long-legged stride, almost elegant but unnaturally extended, like its legs were too long for its body. It moved with purpose, heading straight for the eastern tree line. Then, as if the situation wasn't bizarre enough, a second figure emerged from the exact same spot in the western tree line. This one was smaller, maybe 6 feet tall, but otherwise identical, completely black, same featureless appearance. It was trailing the first figure by about 30 feet, following the exact same path. I sat there, frozen, watching as they both crossed the small stream at the bottom of the ravine. They moved across it with these light, almost delicate steps, barely disturbing the water. The first figure reached the eastern tree line and disappeared into the forest without breaking stride. The second one followed, and within seconds, they were both gone. I must have sat there for another 15 minutes, scanning the tree line, waiting for them to reappear or for something else to happen. Nothing did. What keeps bothering me, even months later, is the complete lack of, well, everything. No equipment, no clothing or gear that I could distinguish, despite being in a remote wilderness area. Who goes hiking in Donner Pass without supplies, without water or protection? It was August, sure, but that's still rough country. Their skin, if you could call it that, had this slight shimmer to it as they moved, not like they were wet or sweating, nothing like that. It was as if they themselves had some kind of glossy quality, reflecting light in a way that normal skin or clothing just doesn't. Their faces, hands, everything was the same uniform black color. Maybe the strangest part was their complete lack of awareness or concern about their surroundings. They never once looked up toward the road where cars were passing. They didn't acknowledge each other either. No communication, no hesitation, nothing that suggested they were even aware of each other. They just moved with this perfect synchronization, appearing from one side of the wilderness and disappearing into the other. After those 15 minutes of waiting, I finally started my truck back up. I drove to the next exit and turned around, determined to find access to that ravine. It took me nearly an hour of navigating service roads to find a way down to the approximate area. I parked and hiked about a quarter mile to where I believed they had crossed. The forest was quiet, too quiet actually. No birds, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just the sound of the stream and the wind in the trees. I found the crossing point easily enough. The stream was shallow there, with smooth rocks forming a natural pathway across. I examined the banks carefully for footprints or any sign of their passing. Nothing. Not a single footprint, not a broken twig, not a displaced stone. It was as if they had never been there at all. I spent another hour searching the area, looking for any evidence of their presence. The entire time, I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up continuously, and I kept turning around, expecting to see one of those figures standing behind me. I never did, but the feeling never went away either. Eventually, the sun started to dip toward the horizon, and I knew I needed to get out of there before dark. As much as I wanted answers, I wasn't about to be caught in that ravine after sunset. Not after what I'd seen. As I hiked back to my truck, I kept going over what I'd witnessed. I've seen bears standing upright. I've seen people in environmental suits. I've seen all kinds of things in my various careers. These weren't any of those things. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, and the movement was too deliberate, too controlled. And environmental suits have equipment, seams, some kind of distinction between the body and the head. These figures had none of that, just smooth, featureless black from head to toe. Once I got back to my truck, I sat there for a few minutes debating whether to report what I'd seen. Who would I even report it to? The park service? Local police? And what would I say? I saw two tall black figures with no faces crossing a ravine. I'd sound crazy, and I knew it. I decided to keep it to myself, at least until I could make sense of it. But it's been months now, and I'm no closer to understanding what I saw that day. I've gone back twice since then, in daylight, armed with a camera. Nothing, no sign of the figures, no evidence they were ever there. I've searched online for similar sightings in the area. There are a few vague reports of shadow people or black figures in various wilderness areas across the country, but nothing quite matches what I saw. Most of those stories involve fleeting glimpses or nighttime encounters. This was broad daylight, and I had a clear view for several minutes. The thing that still bothers me most is their complete lack of acknowledgement. Of me, of each other, of anything. It was like watching two programmed objects moving through space, following a predetermined path without any awareness of their surroundings. Or maybe they were aware, but simply didn't care that they were being observed. I keep thinking about the history of Donner Pass, all that suffering and death back in 1846 and 47. Could there be some connection? I'm not usually one for supernatural explanations, but I can't find a rational one either. Sometimes I wonder if I should have followed them into the trees. Would they have led me somewhere, shown me something, or would I have disappeared too, never to be seen again? I've been a practical, level-headed person my entire life. I've faced combat situations, burning buildings, violent criminals, and none of that scared me as much as those few minutes watching those figures cross that ravine. There was something profoundly wrong about them, something that didn't belong in our world. I still drive that stretch of Route 80 sometimes, and I always slow down at that bridge, always look south toward that ravine. Part of me hopes to see them again, to confirm that I didn't imagine the whole thing. A bigger part of me hopes I never do. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, and she believes I saw something, even if we don't know what it was. A couple of close friends from my Marine days. Guys who know I'm not prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. They don't have explanations either. Last week, I got an email from one of those friends. He sent me a link to an article about unexplained phenomena in national parks and forests. There was a small section about unusual figures sighted in remote areas, often described as unnaturally tall and uniformly dark. The article suggested these might be people in some kind of specialized gear conducting environmental research or monitoring wildlife. But that doesn't explain what I saw. No researcher moves like that. No human moves like that. I've considered all the rational explanations. Shadows playing tricks on my eyes, not for several minutes of continuous observation. People in some kind of stealth gear. Why would they be there, and where did they go without leaving any trace? Some kind of military test of specialized equipment. Possibly, but why in a public area visible from a major highway? I don't have answers, just questions that keep me up at night. All I know for certain is what I saw that August afternoon near Donner Pass. Two black figures, moving with inhuman grace, appearing and disappearing into the wilderness without explanation or trace. Sometimes I think about reaching out to someone, a researcher maybe, or someone who investigates unusual phenomena. But then I remember how it would sound, how crazy I'd seem. So I keep it mostly to myself, turning it over in my mind, wondering if someday I'll find an explanation that makes sense. Until then, I avoid driving that stretch of road after dark. And when I do drive it during the day, I never stop at that bridge anymore. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some mysteries might be better left unsolved. Story 3. I still get chills thinking about what happened back in 2007. It's been years, but some nights I wake up in a cold sweat thinking, I smell that awful stench again. I've never talked about this much outside of my immediate family and the guys who were there. I guess I'm finally ready to get this off my chest. It was early September, Right at the start of hunting season in southwest Washington, me, my Uncle Dave, and two of our hunting buddies, Mike and Steve, were sighting in our rifles on my uncle's property. He owned about 70 acres that backed up to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Beautiful land, really. Mixed forest with some clearings, a creek running through it and mountains in the distance. The kind of place where you could really disconnect from everything. We'd spent most of the day getting our gear ready, checking our stands, and making sure our rifles were properly sighted in. It was getting late in the afternoon, maybe around 4 or 5 o'clock. We were at the edge of this big field that sloped down toward a creek with a thick tree line on the other side. The light was starting to get that golden quality it gets before sunset. I remember I was sitting on this old stump, taking a break and drinking some water, when Mike suddenly got really quiet. He was staring across the creek, squinting. "What the hell is that?" he said, pointing. I couldn't see much with my naked eye except some movement in the trees, so I picked up my rifle to look through the scope. I had a basic 4-power scope, nothing fancy. What I saw through it, man, I still don't know how to properly explain it. There was this figure, standing upright on the other side of the creek. I could only see it from about the chest up because of the slope and underbrush, but what I could see was massive. It was covered in dark brown hair or fur, not like a bear's fur, which is fluffy, but more like matted hair, almost like dreadlocks in some spots. The shoulders on this thing were huge, sloped like a bodybuilder's frame, but way bigger than any human I've ever seen. The waist seemed narrow compared to those shoulders, giving it this weird triangular shape. The arms were what really got me. They were just wrong. Too long for its body, even considering how tall it must have been. They hung down almost to where its knees would be, if I could have seen that far down. Its head was large and had this sloped back shape to it, almost conical, and there was no visible neck. The head just seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. I couldn't make out a face clearly from that distance, just the general shape. The thing that convinced me this wasn't just some bear standing on its hind legs was when it turned slightly. I could see muscles moving under that hair, the way a person's would. Bears don't have that kind of musculature, especially not in their backs and shoulders. This moved like a person, but bigger, much bigger. What it was doing was even stranger. It was grabbing this alder tree, not a sapling, but a full-grown tree, maybe 8 inches in diameter, and shaking it, not like an animal trying to get something down from it. It was violently shaking this entire tree back and forth, like it was testing its strength or something. The whole tree was swaying like it was caught in a hurricane. I remember thinking, that's impossible. Nothing's that strong. We all just froze, watching it. Nobody said a word. I think we were all trying to process what we were seeing. It never made any noise or looked in our direction. It just kept working that tree, occasionally stopping to look around, then going back to it. This went on for about 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. Finally, my Uncle Dave, who's normally the most level-headed guy I know, whispered, "We should go." Just like that. No explanation needed. Nobody argued. We didn't run. We just quietly packed up our gear and walked back to the trucks. Nobody talked about what we'd seen on the drive home. It was like we all silently agreed to process it ourselves first. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my head, trying to make it fit into something I understood. A bear? No way. A person in a suit? In the middle of private property backed by thousands of acres of wilderness? Who would do that, and why? And nobody in a suit could shake a tree like that. I tried to convince myself it was just some weird trick of the light, or that we'd all somehow misinterpreted what we saw. But deep down, I knew better. All 4 of us had seen the same thing. We didn't talk about it for a few weeks. It was like we were all embarrassed or something. Nobody wanted to be the first to bring it up. Then, in mid-October, about 3 weeks after the first incident, Uncle Dave called and said he needed help winterizing the cabin on the property. It was just routine stuff, draining pipes, closing things up for the winter, bringing in the equipment that couldn't stay outside. He asked if I could come help, and if Mike and Steve wanted to join. I think we all secretly wanted to go back, to reassure ourselves that we'd imagined the whole thing. It was a chilly Saturday morning when we headed out. The plan was to get there around noon, work through the afternoon, stay overnight and finish up Sunday morning, just a regular weekend project. We arrived at the property and started unloading our trucks. Uncle Dave remembered he needed some tools from this old shed near the barn, so he drove his truck ahead while the rest of us finished organizing our gear. The shed and barn were maybe a quarter mile from the cabin, down this narrow dirt trail that wound through the trees. We were still by the cabin when I heard my uncle yell. Not a scream exactly, but definitely a shout of surprise or alarm. The three of us immediately dropped what we were doing and ran down the trail toward the barn. I got there first and found my uncle on the ground, tools scattered all around him. He was sitting up, looking dazed but not hurt. His face was pale, though, and he was looking toward the tree. Lined past the barn with this expression I'll never forget. Pure, undiluted fear. That's when the smell hit me. If you've ever smelled a wet dog, multiply that by 100, then mix in rotting meat and stale, musky sweat. It was so thick I could taste it, and it made my eyes water. My stomach lurched, and I had to fight not to gag. Then I heard it, heavy, deliberate breathing coming from just inside the trees past the barn. Not like an animal panting, but deep, controlled breaths. And footsteps. Heavy footsteps, steadily pacing back and forth parallel to the tree line. The underbrush crackled with each step, and small branches snapped. Whatever it was big, and it was right there, just out of sight. I helped my uncle to his feet, and the others caught up to us. Nobody spoke above a whisper. "What happened?" I asked him quietly. He was shaking slightly as he explained. He'd been walking down the trail to the shed when something slammed into him from behind. Not a direct hit, more like a glancing blow that knocked him forward. He fell, dropping all the tools he was carrying. When he rolled over, he didn't see anything at first, but then he heard movement in the trees, and that awful smell washed over him. As he told us this, the thing in the trees kept moving. We could hear it clearly, grunting occasionally, breaking branches, walking in circles just inside the tree line. Then there was a loud splash from the direction of the creek, like something heavy had crossed it, followed by the sound of brush being pushed aside. The four of us stood there for what felt like forever, barely breathing, listening to this thing move around. It never showed itself, but it didn't leave either. It was like it was patrolling, keeping tabs on us. Eventually we backed away slowly, picked up the scattered tools, and retreated to the cabin. We abandoned any plans to stay the weekend. Instead, we quickly grabbed the essentials from the cabin, locked everything up, and decided to sleep in our trucks that night with the doors locked. None of us wanted to drive those dark forest roads after sunset. We left at first light the next morning. I've replayed those encounters in my head countless times over the years. I've read about bears, mountain lions, elk, every animal native to those woods. Nothing matches what we saw and heard. I've read other accounts too, stories from people who've had similar experiences in those mountains. I don't claim to know exactly what we encountered. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and it was not something that's supposed to exist according to biology textbooks. Whatever it was, it knew we were there. It was powerful enough to knock a grown man down without really trying, and it chose to let us leave. Uncle Dave sold the property the following year. He never said it was because of what happened, but he never went back there after that October day. None of us did. Sometimes I still have dreams about looking through that rifle scope and seeing those eyes staring back at me from beneath that sloped forehead. Except in my dreams, it's not staying on its side of the creek. The worst part isn't the fear, though. It's the certainty, the absolute certainty that the woods I've hiked and hunted in my whole life haven't been as empty as I thought they were. Story 4. I've been fishing the islands of eastern Washington for nearly 15 years now, and I thought I knew every inch of my favorite spots. There's this one area I've probably been to hundreds of times, a dense cedar box that runs alongside an old ranch field. I'm 41 now, and I've been going there since my late 20s. It was my escape, my place to decompress and just be with nature. Over the years, I'd occasionally stumble across scattered bones and strange cattle piles. Nothing too concerning. I always just assumed they were left by coyotes that had stolen from the nearby ranches. It made sense, and I never gave it much thought beyond that. Why would I? This was familiar territory for me. There's this particular creek that runs for about 2 miles through some pretty difficult terrain. The whole area is filled with low trees, hidden stumps and fallen logs. Not the easiest place to walk through, but fantastic for grouse and quail hunting. I knew every bend in that creek, every major fallen tree. At least I thought I did. Last Monday changed everything. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I haven't been able to sleep properly since. It started like any other trip. I parked my truck at my usual spot, grabbed my fishing gear, and headed down the path I've walked countless times. It was around 2 in the afternoon, slightly overcast, but still decent visibility. The temperature was in the mid-60s, perfect fishing weather. I remember thinking it was going to be a good day. I was about half a mile in, making my way carefully through the dense underbrush. The ground was still a bit soft from the rain we'd had a couple days before, which made the walking a little slippery but quieter. I was focused on watching my footing, making sure I didn't trip over any hidden roots or stumps. That's when I first noticed the smell. It's hard to describe, musky, almost rancid, but distinctly animal. Not like the normal forest smells I was used to. This was different, stronger, more, I don't know, primal somehow. It hit me suddenly, and I remember stopping in my tracks, my head jerking up to try to locate the source. The smell seemed to be coming from about 30 meters to my right, a bit deeper into the woods than I usually ventured. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to continue on my planned route or investigate. Curiosity got the better of me. As I carefully made my way toward the smell, I kept my eyes peeled, scanning the area ahead of me. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the same trees and underbrush I was used to. Then I spotted it. About 20 meters away, partially obscured by a fallen log and some low-hanging branches, was what I initially thought was a dead bear. It was sitting on the ground, its back to me, and it looked odd, unnaturally still. The color wasn't quite right either, darker than the black bears I was used to seeing in the area, with a strange reddish-brown tint to its fur. I froze, holding my breath. Even though I thought it was dead, years of wilderness experience had taught me to be cautious around potentially dangerous animals. The ground was soft and damp under my feet, allowing me to move quietly. I carefully set down my fishing gear and looked around for something I could use to check if the animal was actually dead without getting too close. I spotted a decent-sized branch nearby and picked it up. It was about as thick as my wrist and maybe 3 feet long. Solid enough to make some noise, but not so heavy that I couldn't swing it easily. I moved a few steps closer, then stopped about 15 meters away from the creature. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the branch, and banged it hard against the trunk of a nearby cedar tree. The sound echoed through the quiet forest, a sharp, cracking noise that should have startled any living thing within earshot. What happened next? I'm still trying to process it. The creature turned its head toward me, not slowly, not groggily like a bear waking up from a nap, but with a quick, deliberate motion that sent chills down my spine. In that split second, I realized this thing was very much alive and very aware of my presence. Before I could even think about what to do next, it shot to its feet and stood fully upright in one unnervingly smooth motion. No stumbling, no adjusting its balance, just straight up onto 2 legs, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then it ran, I've seen bears run. I've seen them stand on their hind legs momentarily when they're curious or threatened. This wasn't that. This thing bolted through the woods on two legs, moving rapidly and with purpose. The sound it made crashing through the brush was incredible, branches snapping, underbrush being trampled. But what struck me most was how efficiently it moved. It navigated between the trees smoothly, without the awkward gait you'd expect from a bear forced to move on its hind legs. In my shock, I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the camera app open. I managed to snap a few pictures as it disappeared into the distance, but when I looked at them later, they were blurry and showed little detail, just a dark shape among the trees. For several minutes after it disappeared, I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The branch I'd been holding was now on the ground. I don't even remember dropping it. The forest had gone completely silent, as if every other creature was holding its breath along with me. Once I managed to get my breathing under control, my first thought was to rationalize what I'd seen. It must have been an injured bear, I told myself. Something had happened to its front legs, forcing it to move awkwardly on two legs. That had to be it. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew that explanation didn't fit what I'd witnessed. The way it moved was too smooth, too quick for an injured animal. Bears don't move like that when they're upright, not for long distances, and certainly not with such ease through dense forest. And then there was its face. When it turned to look at me, I was expecting to see the typical bear snout, the distinctive profile I'd seen countless times before, but its face was different, almost flat, with a broad, wide forehead that didn't look like any bear I'd ever encountered. I only saw it for a split second, but that image is seared into my memory. I gathered my fishing gear with trembling hands and made my way back to my truck as quickly as I could. I didn't run. Some instinct told me running would be a bad idea, but I moved fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and that musky smell seemed to follow me halfway back to my vehicle. When I got home, I spent hours researching online, looking at pictures of bears in various states, injured, standing, running. Nothing matched what I'd seen. I looked up other large mammals native to Washington state, thinking maybe it was some animal I wasn't familiar with. Again, nothing fit. I've been back and forth on whether to report what I saw to anyone official. Who would believe me? What would I even say? I saw something in the woods that moved like a person but wasn't a person. I'd sound crazy, and part of me is afraid of the questions, of having to revisit the experience over and over. For the past week, I've been planning to go back with a better camera, maybe set up some trail cams in the area. But every time I think about actually doing it, I feel this knot in my stomach. Something deep inside me is screaming that going back there alone would be a terrible mistake. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to find logical explanations. Maybe it was a person in some kind of ghillie suit or hunting camouflage, but who would be out there, sitting motionless in the mud? And no person I know could move that fast through such difficult terrain. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, but how would anyone know I'd be there that day? I hadn't told anyone about my fishing plans. Whatever it was, that encounter has changed how I view the wilderness forever. Those woods I've spent 15 years exploring, that I thought I knew like the back of my hand, suddenly feel foreign and threatening. The scattered bones and cattle piles I'd dismissed for years now take on a more sinister significance in my mind. I haven't been back fishing since that day. I'm not sure if I ever will go back to that spot. Every time I close my eyes at night, I see that thing turning its head toward me. That unnatural, fluid motion as it stood upright, the way it moved between the trees with a grace no bear should possess. I keep asking myself, what the hell did I see out there? And more importantly, how many of them are there? Story 5. I've never shared this with anyone outside my immediate family. Even now, 34 years later, I get cold sweats thinking about it. I was 26 back in July of '89, working with my dad on our mining claims in northern Idaho. We'd been at it for years, nothing fancy, just small operations checking gold deposits in streams flowing down from the Bitterroot Range. That summer was unusually hot, the kind of heat that makes the pine sap drip and creates that heavy mountain smell. My dad, my 10-year-old niece Jenny, my sister's kid who was staying with us that summer, and I had driven up in our old Bronco to check on a claim about 15 miles from the nearest town. It was a Wednesday morning, I remember, because we'd planned to be back for the local diner's Wednesday special, pot roast that actually tasted decent. We'd parked at the Forest Service Road and hiked about 2 miles in. The trail wasn't maintained well, just a narrow path cutting through dense woods, following a creek upstream. Dad had been teaching Jenny about prospecting, showing her how to pan for gold, the usual stuff. Around 11 in the morning, I told them I needed to check another possible deposit spot about half a mile upriver. "You go on ahead, Mark," Dad said. "Jenny and I will keep working this spot. Be back in an hour or we'll come looking." I nodded, grabbed my day pack with some water, my notebook, and my .357 Magnum. I always carried it in the backcountry. Mountain lions, black bears, you know the deal. The weight of it on my hip was reassuring. The hike up was uneventful, just me swatting mosquitoes and making mental notes. Of the terrain, I remember checking my watch, 11:42, when I reached the spot I wanted to inspect. It was a small bend in the creek where the water slowed, potentially creating a natural gold trap. I spent maybe 40 minutes there, taking samples, jotting down notes. At 12:30, I packed up to head back. The return trip should have taken 20 minutes tops. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile when I noticed something was off. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows that sudden silence means something's wrong. I slowed down, hand instinctively moving to my pistol. Then I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped dead in my tracks. The path ahead looked like a tornado had torn through it. Trees, big conifers, some 3 feet thick at the base, were snapped like toothpicks about 8 feet up. Not uprooted, just broken. Massive boulders that had been alongside the trail were now displaced. Some pushed 20 feet from where they'd been when I'd walked past them an hour earlier. The ground was torn up, like someone had taken a giant rototiller to it. But what really got to me was this weird greenish slime coating patches of ground and some of the broken trees. It had the consistency of thick mucus and a smell I can only describe as rotting vegetables mixed with ammonia. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I'd been in these mountains my whole life. My first thought was some kind of freak landslide, but that made no sense. The destruction was linear, following the trail, and landslides don't snap trees uniformly at the same height or leave strange slime behind. My stomach dropped. Dad and Jenny were down there. I started running, my boots slipping on the torn-up ground. The destruction continued for maybe 200 yards, then abruptly stopped, like whatever caused it had either disappeared or changed direction. The normal trail resumed, untouched. I slowed down, breathing hard. Listening. That's when I heard it, a sound coming from upriver, from the opposite direction of where Dad and Jenny were. It was like an echo, but not quite. More like a hollow whooshing sound, followed by what I can only describe as a deep, rumbling vocalization. Not an animal sound I recognized, and I knew all the local wildlife. Common sense said to keep moving toward Dad and Jenny. But something else, curiosity, stupidity, whatever you want to call it, made me turn back upriver to investigate. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, then continue down to find my family. I moved cautiously off-trail toward the sound, maybe 50 yards up a slight incline. The forest was still dead quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just that occasional whooshing echo. I crouched behind a fallen log and peered over it toward the sound source. For about 2 minutes, nothing happened. Then, without warning, The entire hillside, about 70 yards away, seemed to explode in fury. Trees shook violently, and something large and black crashed through the underbrush. My first thought was bear cub, because of the size and color. But as it tumbled down the hillside, I realized with growing horror that this thing was much bigger than any bear cub. It rolled down the slope, gathering momentum, snapping saplings and sending rocks flying. And it was headed straight for me. I ducked lower behind the log, drew my pistol and held my breath. The thing crashed to a stop on the trail, maybe 30 feet from my position. What happened next has haunted my nightmares for decades. The creature, and I use that word deliberately because I don't know what else to call it, stood up, on two legs, like a person. It stood there, back partly to me, seemingly disoriented from its tumble. The height is what hit me first. I'm 6 foot even, and this thing's buttocks were level with my eyes if I'd been standing. Had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in black hair, not fur exactly, more like coarse human, hair about 3 centimeters long, covering most of its body. The hair on its head was longer, hanging down like a kind of cape around its shoulders. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. The arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees. The shoulders were massively broad, tapering to a narrower waist. The legs were thick and powerful looking, bent slightly at the knees. I was frozen in place, not daring to breathe. Then it turned slightly, and I caught a partial view of its face. The skin there was brownish, not black like the rest of it, with deep wrinkles under the eyes. The eyes themselves, I couldn't make out the color, but they were set deep under a prominent brow ridge. My hand was shaking so badly I nearly dropped my pistol. Some primal instinct told me this thing was not just dangerous, but somehow wrong, like it shouldn't exist in our world. It made that hollow whooshing sound again, followed by a deep, rumbling vocalization from its chest. Then it sniffed the air and suddenly turned its head in my direction. I don't know if it saw me or smelled me, but in that moment, our eyes met. I raised my pistol and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. The gun was jammed or, and this sounds crazy, something was preventing it from firing. I've never had that .357 fail before or since. The creature just stared at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, with surprising grace for something so large, it simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the thick brush. I stayed frozen for maybe 5 minutes, unable to move, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I finally managed to stand up, my legs were shaking so badly I had to lean against a tree. I checked my pistol. Nothing was visibly wrong with it. I ejected the bullets, reloaded, and it seemed to function normally. To this day, I can't explain why it failed at that crucial moment. I needed to find Dad and Jenny. I started, moving downhill as fast as I could, following the trail of destruction. The forest was still eerily quiet. I'd gone maybe 200 yards when I heard it again, that same whooshing sound, but from much closer. I spun around and saw another one of these creatures. Different from the first, this one was slightly smaller, maybe 7.5 feet, and the hair on its body had a reddish tint to it. It was standing about 50 yards uphill from me, partially hidden behind a large pine. When it saw me looking, it stepped out from behind the tree and made a sound I can only describe as a high-pitched warble, followed by that deep chest rumble. Then it started moving toward me. Not walking, running. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life, down the destroyed trail, jumping over fallen trees, slipping on that strange green slime. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit, its footfalls heavy enough to make the ground vibrate. Trees cracked and splintered as it barreled through them, the sounds it made as it chased me. I still hear them sometimes when I wake up at night. That warbling call, followed by deep chest rumbles, then something like words but not words, vocalizations with structure, with meaning, but nothing human. I glanced back once. It was gaining on me, moving with shocking speed for something so large. Its arms were pumping as it ran, its head lowered like a charging bull. The face, I caught a better glimpse this time, had a protruding jaw and a wide, lipless mouth. I fired my pistol behind me without aiming. The gun worked this time. The shots rang out loud in the silent forest, but I don't think I hit it. It didn't slow down. I was maybe a quarter mile from where I'd left Dad and Jenny. My lungs were burning, legs starting to cramp. I wasn't going to outrun this thing. Then I heard another sound ahead of me, my dad's voice shouting my name. "Mark, down here!" I veered toward his voice, off the main trail and down a steep embankment toward the creek. I half ran, half slid down the slope, branches whipping my face. I could see Dad now, standing in the creek bed with Jenny behind him. He had his rifle raised. "Get down!" he shouted. I dove to the ground as Dad fired 3 rapid shots over my head. The creature let out a sound I'll never forget, a scream that was somehow both animal and not, full of rage and what sounded almost like surprise. When I looked up, the thing was gone, just the sound of breaking branches fading into the distance as it retreated uphill. Dad helped me up. "What the hell was that thing?" he asked, his face pale. "I don't know," I managed between gasping breaths. "There's 2 of them. Did you see the trail? The broken trees?" He nodded grimly. "We heard the commotion about 40 minutes after you left. Thought it was a landslide at first. Then we heard those sounds." Jenny was crying silently, clutching Dad's jacket. "The ground was shaking," she whispered, "and there was green stuff everywhere." We didn't wait around to investigate further. We made our way back to the Bronco as quickly as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders. The whole way, I kept hearing those vocalizations echoing through the valley, calls and responses, like they were communicating with each other. We never reported it officially. Who would believe us? We told a few trusted friends, but most just assumed we'd encountered a bear and panicked. But bears don't break trees 8 feet up. They don't leave strange slime behind. They don't stand 8 feet tall on 2 legs. And they don't make sounds like words. I haven't been back to that specific area since. Dad and I abandoned the claim. Some things aren't worth any amount of gold. Jenny refused to go into the woods for years afterward. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear. That fear and adrenaline made me see things that weren't there. But then I remember the way it looked directly at me, with intelligence in its eyes, the way my gun mysteriously failed, the strange, almost linguistic structure of its vocalizations. I still have nightmares about being chased through those woods, about what might have happened if Dad hadn't been there with his rifle, about what those things were doing in our mountains, and whether they're still there. Story 6. I've never been the type to believe in cryptids or monsters. I'm just a regular guy living in a decent house on the edge of Tanner Creek subdivision in western Oregon. Our property backs up to about 80 acres of forest that eventually connects to national forest land. I've always loved the location, close enough to civilization, but with nature right in my backyard. My wife Sarah and I have lived here for 7 years, and I've spent countless hours hiking those woods. I thought I knew what was out there. I was wrong. This happened last summer in early August. It was unusually hot, even for summer, probably in the high 90s during the day. The night had cooled down to maybe 75 degrees, and I was in my home office finishing up some work emails around 9:30 at night. Our office has these large windows that face the backyard and the tree line beyond. I had the window cracked open because the AC was struggling with the heat wave. That's when I heard it. This weird yelping sound coming from somewhere behind the house. At first I thought it might be coyotes. We get them around here sometimes and they make all sorts of strange noises. But this was different. It was more deliberate. Almost like a child trying to imitate an animal, but not quite getting it right. I tried to ignore it and focus on my work, but the sound kept repeating. Every few minutes, this odd yelp would echo through the trees. After about 20 minutes of this, curiosity got the better of me. I figured maybe it was an injured animal or something, so I grabbed my phone for the flashlight and headed out the side door. Our yard is pretty big. maybe half an acre of maintained grass before it transitions to the wilder forest edge. We've got these motion sensor security lights mounted on the corners of the house that light up most of the yard when triggered. As soon as I stepped out, the side light clicked on, illuminating the yard and the first few rows of trees. The yelping had stopped as soon as I opened the door, which immediately put me on edge. I stood there for a minute, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness beyond the security light's reach. The night was weirdly still. No wind, no cricket sounds, nothing. Just this heavy silence that felt wrong. I walked slowly toward the tree line, straining to hear anything unusual. About halfway across the yard, I heard a rustling sound from my left, toward the side of the house. Not from the forest where I'd been expecting, but from a large maple tree that stands about 15 feet from our house. When I turned to look, I didn't see anything at first. Then I heard it, this soft sound of something moving through branches. Not violent or rushed, but deliberate, like something carefully shifting its weight. I pointed my phone's flashlight toward the sound, and that's when my entire understanding of reality changed forever. There, perched in the tree at about eye level with me, was something. Before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, it moved. An arm, I swear it was an arm, not a paw or a branch, wrapped around the trunk of the tree, and this thing leaned out, like it was studying me. The security light provided enough illumination for me to see it clearly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It had eyes like black marbles, not reflecting my light like an animal's would, but absorbing it. They were set in a face covered with golden brown hair, but the skin underneath was visible on its face and hands, and it was coal black. Not dark brown like a bear, but black like charcoal. My brain was frantically trying to categorize what I was seeing. Too small for a bear, wrong shape for a raccoon, not a monkey. We don't have those in Oregon. In that moment of pure shock, I whispered, "What the F are you?" It just came out, like from that old Schwarzenegger movie. The thing didn't move, didn't blink, just studied me. I realized I was frozen in place too, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. We were maybe 20 feet apart, locked in this bizarre standoff that felt like it was happening outside of normal time. As my initial shock subsided, I started really observing details. The creature was sitting on a branch, and I could clearly see its proportions. Its head to shoulders, shoulders to elbow, elbow to wrist, and its hands, everything was proportioned like a human, but not exactly. The torso looked to be about 16 to 18 inches long in its sitting position. Its arms seemed slightly longer than would be normal for its body size, and those hands, Jesus, those hands weren't paws. They had visible fingers and an opposable thumb. They were gripping the branch with obvious dexterity. The hair covering its body wasn't matted like a bear's fur. It was more like human hair, but everywhere. The face is what really got to me. It wasn't flat like a human's. It had a slight muzzle, but nothing like a bear's snout. The nose was broad and flat, more human-like than animal. Its mouth was closed, but I could see it had lips, not just an animal's muzzle opening. We stayed like that, neither of us moving, for what must have been over 10 minutes. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but I checked my phone later and saw that nearly 15 minutes had passed from when I first stepped outside. The whole time, this juvenile, whatever it was, just watched me with those black eyes. It wasn't acting aggressive or threatening. If anything, it seemed curious, but there was something undeniably wild about it, not like watching a zoo animal behind glass, but like being in the presence of something truly untamed, something that didn't belong in my backyard in suburban Oregon. Eventually, I decided I needed better light and maybe a witness. I slowly started backing away, keeping my eyes on the creature. It didn't move, just kept watching me. When I was about halfway back to the house, I turned and hurried inside to grab a proper flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Sarah was upstairs taking a shower, so I didn't bother calling for her yet. I just grabbed the big mag light and hurried back outside, half expecting the thing to be gone. It wasn't gone. It had moved higher. Now it was about 10 feet up, perched on a thicker limb. But its posture had changed. It was no longer watching me. Instead, it was frozen in a position, gripping the branch with its feet, which also looked hand-like, arms wrapped around the limb above it, almost like it was playing the childhood game of freeze, as if by not moving I wouldn't see it. I trained the flashlight directly on it, getting an even better look. The golden brown hair covering its body had a slight reddish tint in the direct light. I could see its chest moving slightly with breathing, but otherwise it was completely motionless. It wouldn't look at me now, keeping its face turned away. After watching it for another 3 minutes, I decided Sarah needed to see this. I backed away slowly again and went inside to get her. She had just finished her shower, and I probably sounded like a lunatic trying to explain what was in our tree. But something in my expression must have convinced her I wasn't joking, because she threw on some clothes and followed me outside. By the time we got back out there, maybe 2 minutes later, it was gone, completely vanished. We searched the tree with the flashlight, then the surrounding trees and yard, but there was no sign of the creature. Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and honestly, I was beginning to wonder if I had. Maybe it was just a raccoon, she suggested, but I could tell she was just trying to be supportive. I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't a damn raccoon. The proportions, the hands, the face, none of it matched any animal I'd ever seen or heard of in these woods. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Bear cub? No, completely wrong shape, and those hands were nothing like a bear's paws. Monkey? Impossible in Oregon. Some kid in a costume. At 9:30 at night in our tree, perfectly still for over 10 minutes. No way. I spent the next 3 nights sleeping in the guest bedroom, which has the best view of that side of the yard. I left the security lights on and kept waking up whenever they triggered. A few times they did activate, but when I looked out, I couldn't see what had set them off. Whatever had been in our tree never showed itself to me again. In the following days, I researched local wildlife extensively. I looked up every possible animal native to Oregon. Nothing matched. Then I started looking into other explanations. That's when I found descriptions of juvenile Sasquatch encounters that gave me chills. The proportions, the black skin with contrasting hair, the curious but cautious behavior. It all lined up disturbingly well with what I'd seen. I've never been a believer in cryptids or Bigfoot. I always thought those stories were just misidentifications or outright hoaxes. But now, I don't know what to believe anymore. What I saw was real. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a known animal, and definitely wasn't human. I haven't told anyone besides Sarah about this. She's supportive but skeptical. She thinks I probably saw some unusual animal, and my mind filled in the blanks with something more fantastic. Maybe she's right. But those hands, those eyes, that face, they weren't anything I've ever seen in the natural world. It's been 4 months now, and I still find myself looking out toward that maple tree every night before bed. The security lights still occasionally trigger for no apparent reason. Sometimes when I'm alone in the house, I swear I can hear that strange yelping sound in the distance, but it never gets close enough to investigate. I don't know what I encountered that night, a juvenile Sasquatch, some undiscovered species, a figment of my imagination brought on by stress and the weird stillness of that hot summer night. All I know is that the woods behind my house don't feel the same anymore. When I look out there now, I'm always aware that something might be looking back, something with coal black skin, golden brown hair, and eyes like black marbles that seem to see right through you. Story 7. I've never shared this with anyone outside my family until now. It happened about 6 months ago, and I still can't explain it. My parents think I should just forget about it, but honestly, I can't. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I'm hoping writing it all out might help me process what happened. We live in Pinewood, a tiny dot on the map that most people drive through without even noticing. It's the kind of rural place where everyone knows everyone and nothing much happens. Our house sits on about 2 acres, with woods behind us and the nearest neighbor about a quarter-mile down the road. It's usually peaceful, almost too quiet sometimes, which is why what happened that night stands out so much. I'm a bit of a night owl, always have been. My parents gave up trying to enforce a bedtime when I hit 17. As long as I make it to school and keep my grades up, they don't really care if I'm up until 3 or 4 in the morning playing games or just scrolling through stuff online. My bedroom is on the ground floor, toward the back of the house, with a window that looks out onto our backyard. That night, it was a Tuesday in January, I was up, late as usual. My parents and little sister were asleep upstairs, and I was the only one awake, playing some mindless battle royale game with my headphones on. It must have been around 3 in the morning when I took my headphones off to grab a drink from the kitchen. That's when I heard it. At first I thought maybe it was just the house settling or the wind. Our place is pretty old, built in the 70s, and it makes all kinds of weird noises, especially in winter. But this was different. It was a distinct scraping sound, metal against wood, coming from my window. Now, directly below my window is where we keep our 3 dogs in their outdoor kennel. They're small yappers, a Jack Russell and 2 mixed breeds that my mum rescued. Those dogs bark at everything. I mean, a leaf falls 3 counties over and they're losing their minds. But what freaked me out immediately was that they were completely silent, not a single bark. I froze with my hand on the doorknob, just listening. The scraping stopped, and then I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. Breathing, deep, heavy breathing right outside my window. It wasn't human breathing. At least it didn't sound like any human I've ever heard. Each inhale was this slow, deliberate draw of air that seemed to last forever, followed by an equally measured exhale. It reminded me of how a predator breathes when it's scenting something. I was paralyzed. My window has those old-fashioned latches that you turn to lock it, and I suddenly couldn't remember if I'd locked it earlier. The breathing continued, in and out, and then there was this snort, like someone clearing their sinuses, but deeper and more guttural than any human could make. It was followed by another snort, and then a sound like something was sniffing the glass. All this time, and it probably only lasted 20 or 30 seconds, but felt like hours. Our dogs made no sound whatsoever. That's what scared me the most. Those dogs bark if I get up to use the bathroom at night. They bark at raccoons, at cars passing on the distant road, at absolutely nothing sometimes. But whatever was outside my window had them completely silent. I didn't dare approach the window. Instead, I backed out of my room, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I went to the living room, grabbed the throw blanket from the couch, and laid down on the floor behind the coffee table where I couldn't be seen from any of the windows. I didn't sleep at all. I just laid there, straining to hear any sound, either from whatever was outside or from our dogs. But there was nothing, just this oppressive silence that seemed to fill the entire house. When morning finally came, I was still on the floor, stiff and exhausted. My mom came downstairs around 6 and found me there. She thought I'd fallen asleep gaming and just crashed on the floor. I didn't tell her what happened, not yet. I was worried she'd think I was just being dramatic or had fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. I waited until my dad got home from work that evening. He works second shift at the factory in the next town over, so he doesn't get home until around 11. I told him everything while Mom was putting my sister to bed. Dad's not the type to dismiss things outright, especially when it comes to potential safety issues. He grabbed his flashlight and went outside to check around my window. It was freezing cold, and there was a light dusting of snow on the ground from earlier in the day. I followed him out, keeping close to his side. The dogs were acting normal again, barking at us as we approached their kennel. Dad shined his light all around the area below my window. The ground was mostly frozen, so there weren't any obvious footprints, but he noticed something that made my stomach drop. My window, the casement style that opens outward, was pushed in slightly, like something had been applying pressure from the outside. It wasn't. Broken, and the latch was still engaged from the inside, but it was definitely not sitting right. Could the wind have done that? I asked, knowing full well that it couldn't have. Dad just shook his head. It would take something with considerable force to push it in like that, he said quietly, especially with the latch engaged. He checked the dog's kennel, but found nothing unusual. The dogs themselves were completely fine, no signs of distress or injury. They were just normal, like nothing had happened. That night, I slept on the couch in the living room, and the next night, and the night after that. I actually ended up sleeping there for nearly 3 weeks before I could bring myself to go back to my room. My parents didn't push it. I think they were spooked too, though they tried not to show it. 2 days after the incident, something else happened that made everything even more unsettling. My dad had gone into town to pick up some groceries. We have this old storage trailer at the edge of our property where we keep gardening equipment, some old furniture and holiday decorations. It's nothing fancy, just a metal trailer about the size of a small bedroom. But we keep it secured with this heavy metal wedge that Dad made years ago. It's basically impossible to open without removing the wedge. When Dad got back from shopping, he noticed the door to the trailer standing wide open. The metal wedge was lying on the ground, about 6 feet away from the door. Not like it had fallen out, like it had been deliberately removed and tossed aside. Dad called me out to look at it. "Did you come out here today?" he asked, even though he knew I hadn't. "No," I said. "Mom and my sister had been at my grandma's all day, and I hadn't left the house. We checked inside the trailer, but nothing seemed to be missing or disturbed. Just the fact that something had opened it, had deliberately removed that heavy metal wedge, was enough to send chills down my spine." Dad installed motion-activated floodlights around the house the next day. He also bought a new lock for the trailer, a proper padlock this time, and started taking our dogs inside at night. Mom suggested it might have been teenagers messing around, but we all knew better. Teenagers wouldn't have been able to push in my window like that, and they certainly wouldn't have made those breathing sounds. For weeks afterward, I kept waking up at 3 in the morning, the exact time I'd heard those sounds. It didn't matter where I slept or how tired I was. My eyes would snap open at 3 a.m., my body rigid with fear, listening for those deep breaths outside. We never reported it to the police. What would we even say? That something breathed on my window and opened our trailer, that our normally yappy dogs went completely silent in the presence of whatever it was? It sounds crazy saying it out loud even now. I've spent hours researching possible explanations. Could it have been a bear? We don't typically get them in our area, but it's not impossible. But bears make noise, and they certainly don't silently unlatch trailer doors. A person? Maybe, but who could make those inhuman breathing sounds? And why would our dogs stay silent? My dad installed a security camera system about a month after it happened. We haven't caught anything unusual on the cameras yet, but sometimes when I'm up late and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear something moving around outside. Not the usual nocturnal animals or the wind in the trees. Something deliberate. Something that knows we're here. I finally moved back into my room, but I keep my blinds drawn tight and I've pushed my dresser in front of the window. I don't stay up as late anymore either. Something about being the only one awake in the house when everyone else is asleep feels too vulnerable now. The strangest part is that sometimes I'll notice the dogs staring off into the woods behind our house, completely still and silent. No barking, no growling, just staring intently at something none of us can see. When that happens, I go inside and lock the doors, no matter what time of day it is. I don't know what was outside my window that night. I don't know what opened our trailer. But I do know that something found our house, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching us, waiting for the right moment to return. The dogs still bark at delivery trucks and neighbors and squirrels. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, they'll all go completely silent at once, and that's when I know it's back. Story 8. I still get chills thinking about what happened that day. It's been 3 months, and I can't shake the image from my head. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids, but what I saw in those woods near Newbury changed everything for me. I'm an amateur photographer with a weird hobby. I love photographing old headstones and cemeteries. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the weathered stones, the dates, the forgotten stories. My friends Alex, Megan, and Devon share this interest, and we often take weekend trips to explore obscure, historical graveyards. Last October, we heard about this really old cemetery deep in the woods near Newbury, Michigan. It was supposedly from the late 1800s, with some unique headstone carvings that weren't documented well online. The kind of place that gets cemetery enthusiasts like us excited. We drove up early on a Saturday morning. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with that crisp fall air that makes the Upper Peninsula so beautiful that time of year. We had rough directions from a local history forum, but nothing precise. GPS wasn't reliable once we left the main roads, so we were navigating with printed maps and screenshots. After about 3 hours of driving, we found what we thought was the access road, really just a dirt path. Barely wide enough for my Honda Civic. I remember joking that we should have borrowed someone's truck instead. We drove down it as far as we could, maybe half a mile, until fallen branches and overgrowth made it impossible to continue. "Looks like we're walking from here," Alex said, grabbing his camera bag. We gathered our equipment, cameras, water bottles, snacks, a first aid kit, Megan's always prepared, and started down the path that supposedly led to the cemetery. It was around 11 in the morning. The forest was dense. Tall pines and maples with their fall colors created this canopy that filtered the sunlight in these strange patterns on the ground. I remember thinking it would make for great photos. The path was narrow, forcing us to walk single file. Devon took the lead since he had looked at the maps the most, followed by Megan, then Alex, with me bringing up the rear. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes, chatting about what we might find when something caught my attention. It was just a movement at first, something in my peripheral vision off to the right side of the path. I didn't think much of it, probably a deer or something, but then I felt this pressure. I don't know how else to describe it, like when you know someone's watching you. I slowed down a bit, letting the others get a few steps ahead, and turned to look. That's when I saw it. About 25 feet away, partially hidden between 2 large pine trees, stood something I still struggle to describe. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear standing upright, maybe. But no, this was something else entirely. It was tall, I'm 6 feet, and this thing towered over me, probably 6.5 or 7 feet. What struck me immediately was the fur, a strange blonde color, almost golden in the dappled sunlight, covering its entire body. Not like a bear's fur, which is usually darker and shaggier. This was more uniform, almost like a lion's coat, but thicker. The build is what really got to me. This thing was massive, not fat, but powerfully built with shoulders that must have been twice the width of mine. The proportions were all wrong for a human, but didn't match any animal I'm familiar with either. The most unsettling part was that it had no visible neck. Its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. Its face, God, I still see that face in my dreams. The skin was lighter than the fur, almost pale, with deep-set eyes that were dark. Not animal eyes, but not quite human either. They were focused, intelligent, watching me with what I can only describe as calculated interest. There was no aggression, No immediate threat, but something in those eyes made my blood run cold. The creature remained perfectly still, except for slight shifts of its weight. It stood upright the entire time, completely bipedal, and never once dropped to all fours like a bear would. Despite its bulk, there was this unnerving grace to its movements, minimal, deliberate, confident. When it did move, transferring its weight from one foot to another or shifting slightly behind the tree, I could see the muscles in its arms and chest flexing beneath the fur. It had the kind of strength that made me think it could tear a person apart without effort. What strikes me even now is how utterly silent it was. Something that size should have made noise, breaking twigs, rustling leaves, but there was nothing. Complete silence. The woods themselves seemed to go quiet around it, like everything was holding its breath. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. My friends had continued walking, unaware that I'd stopped. They were maybe 15 feet ahead when the reality of what I was seeing finally hit me. Pure terror took over. I didn't call out to my friends. I didn't take a photo, despite having a camera hanging around my neck. I just turned and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I blew past my friends, nearly knocking Alex over. I could hear them calling after me, confused, but I couldn't stop. All I could think was getting back to the car, getting away from whatever that thing was. My lungs were burning, branches whipped at my face. I stumbled multiple times but kept going. I reached the car first, fumbling with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. When I finally did, I dove inside and locked all the doors immediately. It wasn't until I heard the others pounding on the windows that I realized what I'd done. I'd locked them out. "Jackson, what the hell, man?" Devon was shouting, his face a mix of confusion and anger. I was hyperventilating, trying to catch my breath enough to speak. After a moment, I reached over and unlocked the doors, but I couldn't bring myself to get out again. They piled in, all talking at once. "What happened? Are you having a panic attack? Did you see something?" I couldn't answer right away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept looking out the windows, scanning the tree line, convinced that thing was following us. "We need to go," I finally managed to say. "Now. We need to go right now." "What's going on?" Megan asked, her voice gentler than the others. "You're scaring us, Jackson." I started the car with trembling hands, throwing it into reverse and backing up way too fast down the narrow path. I scraped the side against branches, not caring about the paint job, just needing to get back to the main road. It wasn't until we were on the highway, heading back toward town, that I could breathe enough to tell them what I'd seen. As I described the creature, I watched their expressions change from concern to skepticism. "Maybe it was a bear," Alex suggested. "They can look weird when they stand up." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "It never went on all fours, and bears don't have blonde fur or move like that." "Could have been a person in a ghillie suit," Devon offered. "Hunters use them sometimes." I shook my head. No hunter is 7 feet tall with shoulders that wide. And why would someone in a hunting suit just stand there watching us? "You said yourself you only saw it for a few seconds," Megan said gently. "Fear can make us see things differently." I knew what they were doing, trying to rationalize, to make sense of something that defied explanation. I couldn't blame them. They hadn't seen it. But their disbelief only made me feel more alone. "I know what I saw," I said quietly. "And it wasn't human, and it wasn't a bear." The drive back was mostly silent after that. I could tell they were worried about me, exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following our car somehow. One detail I kept coming back to was the absence of any smell. Bears have a distinctive odor, so do most large animals. But there was nothing, no scent at all that I could detect. No sounds either beyond the normal forest ambience, just that eerie, watchful presence. We stopped for food at a diner about an hour outside Newbury. I couldn't eat much, my stomach still in knots. While the others were in the bathroom, I showed the waitress, an older woman who'd mentioned living in the area her whole life, the location on our map, and asked if she knew anything about strange sightings around there. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of laughing it off, she got this serious look and lowered her voice. "That old cemetery. People don't go there much anymore," she said. "There've been stories about that area for years. Hunters reporting things they can't explain, missing hikers that were never found." "What kind of things?" I pressed. She shrugged. "Just things. Strange noises. Feeling watched. Most folks around here stay clear of those woods if they can help it." She didn't say more because my friends returned, but her words sent a fresh wave of chills through me. This wasn't just my imagination. There was something out there. When I got home, I spent days researching, looking into local legends, cryptid sightings, anything that might explain what I saw. The closest thing I found were some obscure forum posts about a Michigan Bigfoot with unusually light-colored fur that had been spotted in the Upper Peninsula over the years. But this wasn't like the Bigfoot descriptions I've read. This was something different. The intelligence in those eyes. It wasn't just an animal. It knew what it was doing. It was watching us, studying us, hunting us maybe. I've gone back and forth about reporting it to someone official, but who would believe me? My own friends don't, not really. They humor me now, careful not to bring it up, treating me like I had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. I haven't gone back to photography since then. My camera sits unused in its bag. I can't bring myself to go into the woods anymore, even the local park near my apartment. At night, I still wake up sometimes, convinced I can see those eyes watching me from the corner of my room. The thing that haunts me most is wondering, what if I hadn't looked to my right at that exact moment? Would it have approached us? Was it following us all along? And how many others has it watched from between the trees, silent and waiting? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that something is out there in those woods near Newbury. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I can't shake the feeling that it remembers me too. Story 9. I've debated whether to share this for years. What happened back in '91 still keeps me up some nights, and I've never found any explanation that makes sense. My wife says writing it down might help, so here goes. It was August 1991, and 6 of us were camping at 20 Mile Bay on Harrison Lake in British Columbia. Me, my girlfriend Sarah, now my wife, and 2 other couples, Mike and Jen, Trevor and Lisa. We were all dirt bike enthusiasts, and this was our 3rd summer camping trip together. The weather was perfect that year, warm days, cool nights, and barely any rain. On our 3rd day, while the girls were planning to hang around the campsite and go swimming, me, Mike and Trevor decided to take our bikes out for a longer ride. We'd heard about some amazing trails that would take us from our campsite all the way to the north end of Chehalis Lake via Mystery Creek Road. It was ambitious, probably a full day's journey there and back, but we were experienced riders and had packed enough supplies. We set out around 8 in the morning. The first couple hours were incredible, powering through forest trails, climbing ridges with spectacular views of the mountains. The bikes were running perfectly, and there was this sense of freedom you only get when you're miles from civilization with nothing but forest around you. Around 10:30, we reached this ridge that ran parallel to Chehalis Lake. From our maps, we could see there were several spur roads branching off the main trail, and we figured we could cover more ground if we split up to explore them. We agreed to take separate paths and meet back at the junction in 30 minutes. I took the middle spur road. It wound through some dense forest before gradually climbing upward. After about 15 minutes of riding, the trail narrowed and eventually dead-ended at this amazing bluff overlooking Chehalis Lake. I cut the engine and took off my helmet, just taking in the view. The lake stretched out below, this stunning deep blue surrounded by mountains. It was breathtaking, one of those perfect spots you stumble across by accident. I walked to the edge of the bluff to get a better look, thinking this would make an incredible camping spot for our next trip. The drop was about 60 feet down to the water, with a small beach area below. I was mentally planning how we could potentially get our gear down there when something changed. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but the atmosphere shifted. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times more intense. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt this pressure, almost like the air got heavier. This wasn't the normal uneasiness you sometimes get in the wilderness. I've spent my whole life outdoors, and I know the difference between normal wilderness awareness and genuine fear. This was something else entirely. Something felt wrong, threatening, like there was an intelligence behind it. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing unusual. No movement, no sounds besides the normal forest noises, but the sensation of being observed, being hunted, only intensified. My mouth went dry and my heart started racing. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave. I didn't even bother taking any photos like I'd planned. I just backed away from the edge, put my helmet back on, and fired up my bike. As I turned around to head back down the trail, I gave one last look at the forest surrounding the bluff. Still nothing visible, but that feeling of being watched hadn't diminished at all. I rode back to the meeting point faster than was probably safe on that narrow trail. Mike and Trevor were already there waiting, looking relaxed and excited about what they'd found on their explorations. "Dude, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mike said when I pulled off my helmet. I tried to play it cool, not wanting to sound paranoid. "Nah, just found something interesting. There's this awesome bluff overlooking the lake. Could be an epic camping spot. Thought maybe we should check it out together." I didn't mention the weird feeling. It seemed stupid now that I was back with the guys, and I figured maybe I'd just psych myself out being alone out there. Trevor was immediately interested. "Hell yeah, let's go look. We've still got plenty of daylight." So we headed back down the trail I'd just come from. I led the way, feeling much better having the guys with me. The forest seemed normal again, just trees and dirt and the sound of our engines echoing through the woods. I started wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. We rode for about 10 minutes when I suddenly had to brake hard. There, blocking the entire width of the trail, were trees, not branches or debris, actual trees. Around 12 of them, all roughly 8 to 10 inches thick at the trunk, laid perfectly across the path, like a deliberate barricade. I sat there on my bike, trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't trees that had fallen naturally. They had been placed there, arranged specifically to block the trail. And most disturbing of all, they were laying across my fresh tire tracks from just minutes earlier. Let me repeat that. These trees had been placed there after I had already passed through on my way back from the bluff. Someone, or something, had deliberately blocked the path behind me. Mike pulled up beside me. "What the hell?" Trevor stopped on my other side. "Did you see this on your way out?" I shook my head, unable to find words for a moment. "No, these are on top of my tracks. Someone put these here after I left." That's when it hit all three of us simultaneously. I actually watched as Trevor and Mike both reached up to touch the backs of their necks, the same way I was doing. We all felt it, that cold wave of realization and fear washing over us. Whatever had been watching me at the bluff had done this, and it had done it quickly, silently, and with incredible strength. These weren't saplings. Each of these trees would have taken at least 2 strong men to carry and position, and there were no sounds of chainsaws or equipment, just silence. No one said a word. We didn't need to. Without discussion, we all put our helmets back on, turned our bikes around, and rode away from there as fast as we could manage on. The rough trail. Only when we were back on the main ridge road did we stop to talk about what we'd seen. "What the fuck was that?" Trevor's voice was shaking slightly. That's not normal." Mike kept looking back the way we'd come. Could it have been other hikers? Some kind of prank? I shook my head. In 15 minutes? 12 trees that size? No way. And we didn't pass anyone else on the trails all morning. Logging operation, maybe? Trevor suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. With no equipment, no trucks, no noise, I said. And why block just that one trail right after I used it? We fell silent again, each trying to come up with a rational explanation and failing. The forest around us suddenly seemed different, less welcoming, more ominous. Every shadow between the trees could be hiding something watching us. "Let's get back to camp," Mike finally said. "I don't want to be out here when it gets dark." The ride back was tense. We didn't split up again, staying in tight formation with Mike in front, me in the middle, and Trevor watching our backs. We didn't stop for breaks or to appreciate views. We just rode, pushing to get as much distance between us and that place as possible. What should have been an enjoyable journey back felt like an escape. Every time the trail narrowed or passed through denser sections of forest, I felt that same sensation of being observed. Several times I could have sworn I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We made it back to 20 Mile Bay just before dusk, physically exhausted and mentally drained. The girls could tell something was wrong as soon as they saw our faces, but we struggled to explain. How do you describe something like that without sounding crazy? That night around the campfire, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Locals playing pranks on tourists, some kind of territorial dispute with other riders, a rogue logger with superhuman strength. Nothing made sense. We cut our trip short, packing up the next morning instead of staying the planned 5 days. None of us explicitly said it was because of what happened, but we all knew. I've researched the area extensively since then. There are legends about Sasquatch in those mountains, but I've never been one to believe in cryptids. There are also stories of territorial disputes between different groups in the backcountry, but nothing that explains what we experienced. It's been over 30 years now, and I've never been back to that spot. Mike, Trevor, and I still ride together occasionally, but we never go near Chehalis Lake. We don't talk about it much anymore, but when we do, none of us have changed our stories. We all saw those trees laid across my tire tracks. We all felt that presence watching us. I still can't explain what happened that day. Whatever was in those woods was intelligent enough to wait until I left, strong enough to move those trees quickly, and territorial enough to send a clear message: you're not welcome here. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd continued past that barricade toward the bluff. But mostly, I'm grateful we understood the warning and left while we still could. Story 10. I still don't feel right talking about this. It's been almost 2 years since that night, but I get goosebumps just thinking about it. I've barely told anyone because I know how it sounds, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened on April 24th, 2021. I remember the date clearly because it was the day before my friend's birthday, and I was planning to meet her the next day. I live in Issaquah, Washington. It's this small city east of Seattle with lots of wooded areas and hiking trails. Pretty place during the day, but at night, those woods take on a different feeling. I've been going to this 24-hour gym for about 3 years now. It's nothing fancy, just a local place with basic equipment, but the hours work perfectly with my weird schedule. I usually go late, around 10 or 11 at night, when there are fewer people around. I like having the place mostly to myself. That night, I finished my workout around midnight. I remember checking my phone as I walked out. It was 12:07, and I had a text from my mom asking if I was home yet. I didn't answer right away because I was focused on getting to my car. The gym's parking lot isn't huge, maybe 30 spaces total, and it backs up directly to this dense patch of forest. During the day, it's just trees, but at night, well, it's basically a wall of darkness. The parking lot has these overhead lights, but they're spread out pretty far apart, creating these pools of yellow light with shadows in between. My car was parked near the back, about 3 spaces away from the tree line. There were only 2 other cars in the lot. One belonged to the night shift guy working at the gym, and I'm not sure about the other. As I was walking to my car, I felt, I don't know how to describe it exactly, like something was off. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? It was like that, but stronger. My skin was prickling. I tried to brush it off. I'm a 20-year-old woman alone at midnight. Of course I'm going to feel paranoid, right? I had my keys in my hand, thumb on the panic button like my dad always taught me. I was maybe 15 feet from my car when I heard it, a twig snapping in the woods. Not a little crack, but a solid snap, like something heavy had stepped on a decent-sized branch. I froze. My first thought was deer. We have tons of them around here, and they often come out at night. But something told me this wasn't a deer. It was too deliberate. I slowly turned toward the sound, still clutching my keys. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the trees, partially hidden but clearly visible, was this figure. I say figure because my brain couldn't immediately process what I was seeing. It was tall, really tall, standing upright like a person but way bigger, at least 7 feet, probably closer to 8. And it was grey, not like grey clothes, but grey skin or fur or whatever covered it. In the dim light, I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but I could see its outline against the darkness of the forest behind it. For a second, literally just 1 second, we stared at each other. I felt my heart stop, then start hammering so hard I thought it would explode. The thing was just watching me, not moving except for what looked like slight swaying. Then it shifted its weight, and that's when I realized how wrong its movements were. It wasn't clumsy or lumbering like you'd expect something that big to be. It was fluid, almost graceful, but in a way that felt completely unnatural, like it could move faster than anything that size should be able to move. I didn't stick around to see more. Pure instinct took over, and I ran the last few steps to my car, fumbling with my keys. I've never unlocked a door so fast in my life. I practically threw myself inside, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I could get them in the ignition. As I started the car and turned on the headlights, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The thing stepped forward, just barely out of the tree line now. In the splash of my headlights, I could see it more clearly for a split second. Its proportions were all wrong, arms too long, torso too narrow, and it moved like water almost. Smooth, but impossible. I threw the car into reverse, backed out way too fast, and then peeled out of that parking lot like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. I couldn't. I was terrified of what I might see. I drove for about 10 minutes before I realized I was hyperventilating. I pulled into another parking lot, a well-lit Safeway that was closed but still had all its lights on, and just sat there, trying to breathe. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I called my roommate, but she didn't pick up. I didn't know who else to call, who would believe me. I sat there for almost 45 minutes, jumping at every shadow that moved past my car. Eventually, I got myself together enough to drive home, but I took a different route, avoiding roads that went near wooded areas. When I got home, my roommate was asleep, and I was almost glad. I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen. I barely slept that night. I kept seeing that grey figure every time I closed my eyes, the way it moved, so wrong and yet so deliberate. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a person. Maybe someone in a costume trying to scare people. But why would anyone be in the woods at midnight in a creature costume? And no costume could explain how it moved. I almost didn't say anything to anyone, but around noon I broke down and called the non-emergency police number. The officer who took my call was polite but skeptical. He said they'd send someone to check it out, but I could tell he thought I was either drunk or seeing things. Later that day, an officer called me back. He said they'd searched the area for about 10 minutes and found some deer tracks, but nothing unusual. No footprints matching what I described. No evidence that anything had been there at all. He suggested it might have been a particularly large deer standing on its hind legs, which can happen when they're reaching for leaves. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a person, and it wasn't just standing on its hind legs to reach leaves. It was watching me, deliberately, with intelligence. I've been back to that gym since then, but never alone and never after dark. I switched to morning workouts. Sometimes I drive past at night and look at that tree line, and my stomach knots up. The rational part of me says it was nothing. Stress, poor lighting, an active imagination. But I know what I saw. A few weeks after it happened, I tried researching local legends or similar sightings in the area. Issaquah has its share of Bigfoot stories, like most places in the Pacific Northwest. But what I saw wasn't Bigfoot. It wasn't hairy or brown. It was grey and smooth, almost like it had skin rather than fur. And the way it moved, I've never seen anything move like that, not in real life and not in movies. I found a few vague accounts online, people describing tall grey figures in the woods around the Cascade foothills, but nothing specific enough to match what I saw. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. I still live in Issaquah. I still hike those same woods during the day with friends. But something changed for me that night. I'm always aware of the tree line now, always watching the shadows at the edge of my vision, always wondering if it's watching me too. Sometimes I wonder if I really saw what I think I saw. Memory is tricky, and fear can distort things. But then I remember how it moved, that fluid, impossible motion, and I know I didn't imagine that. You can't imagine something you've never seen before, something your brain has no reference for. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it meant me harm or was just curious. I don't know if it's still out there in those woods. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night and pass by dark patches of forest, I find myself speeding up a little. The weirdest part? Sometimes I feel like I need to go back, like I left something unfinished. It's this pull I can't explain. I've driven to that parking lot a few times at night, just sitting in my car with the engine running, staring at that same spot in the trees. I've never gotten out. I've never seen it again. But every time I get that same feeling, like I'm being watched. Last week I thought I saw something grey moving between houses in my neighborhood at dusk. Just a flash of movement, gone before I could really focus on it. Probably nothing. Probably just a trick of the light or a large bird. But I'm sleeping with my blinds closed now. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that whatever it was, it doesn't belong in our world. At least not the world as I understood it before April 24th. I haven't been back to that gym in months now. I joined a different one closer to my house, one with a parking lot surrounded by buildings, not trees. I still work out late sometimes, but I'm always with a friend now, and I always check the shadows before I get in my car. If you've seen something similar around Issaquah or anywhere in Washington, please let me know. I need to know I'm not crazy. I need to know I'm not the only one who's seen it, because sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's looking for me, if it remembers me the way I remember it. And I wonder what happens if it finds me again. Story 11. I'm still trying to process what happened that day in 1976. Richard and I have talked about it countless times over the years, but we've never reached a satisfying explanation. We were both trained scientists. I specialized in vertebrate zoology at the university, but nothing in our education prepared us for what we saw. It was late August. Richard and I had taken our boys, Tommy, 7, and Mark, 5, camping with a few families from our neighborhood at Howard's Creek, about 40 miles southeast of Eugene. The spot was fairly remote, accessed by a winding gravel road that followed the creek for about 3 miles off the main highway. We'd been there since Friday afternoon, enjoying the perfect summer. Weather, warm days, cool nights, clear skies. By Sunday morning, everyone else in our group had packed up to head home. The Millers left first, around 8, followed by the Hendersons and the Patels. Richard and I decided to stay until mid-afternoon since we both had Monday off work. The boys were having such a good time exploring, and honestly, we were enjoying the peace after the somewhat chaotic energy of 3 families with kids all camping together. After a late breakfast of pancakes cooked over the campfire, we decided to take a walk around the campground loop. The campground was arranged in a rough circle with about 20 sites spread along a single-lane dirt road that wound through the trees for maybe half a mile before connecting back to itself. Most of the sites were empty by Sunday, and we thought it would be nice to stretch our legs before packing up. I should mention that Richard and I are both tall. I'm 6'3" and he's 6'4". We've always been the tallest couple in any room. Tommy was already tall for his age too, clearly taking after us. This detail becomes important later. It was around 11 in the morning when we set off. The boys ran ahead, collecting pine cones and rocks, while Richard and I followed at a leisurely pace. The forest was particularly dense on this side of the campground, with towering Douglas firs and thick undergrowth creating a wall of vegetation beyond the cleared camping areas. We'd made it about halfway around the loop to the point furthest from our campsite, when Tommy stopped suddenly and pointed to something moving in the trees to our right. "Dad, look!" he called. Richard was about to respond when we all saw it. Something massive emerging from the thick brush about 30 yards ahead of us. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like my perception refused to accept the information my eyes were sending. It stepped onto the road, and I instinctively grabbed both boys and pulled them against me. Richard moved slightly in front of us, though I could tell from his posture he was just as stunned as I was. The figure, and I use that word deliberately because it moved with such purpose, stood at least 8 feet tall. I'm not exaggerating. Richard and I are used to looking most people in the eye or down at them, but this thing would have towered over us by a good 1.5 feet. What struck me immediately was how it moved. Completely upright on 2 legs, not hunched or awkward like a bear might be if it stood up briefly. Its arms hung at its sides, bent slightly at the elbows, swinging in a disturbingly human-like manner as it walked. But there was nothing human about its size or appearance. The creature was incredibly broad. Its shoulders must have been at least 3 feet wide, and it was covered completely in thick, dark brown fur. Not patchy or mangy like a sick bear, but a uniform coat that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. It paused for just a moment in the middle of the road, no more than 20 yards from us now, and turned its head slightly in our direction. I couldn't make out its face clearly, just a darker area where eyes might be, partially obscured by the fur. That moment probably lasted only a second or two, but it felt like time had stopped. I remember hearing nothing but my own heartbeat and the boys' shallow breathing. Then, in just 3 or 4 strides of its impossibly long legs, it crossed the road and disappeared into the dense undergrowth on the left side. The vegetation swayed and cracked as it moved away, and then everything was still again. For several seconds, none of us moved or spoke. Mark started crying first, pressing his face against my leg. Tommy was trembling, but trying to act brave. "What was that, Mom?" he whispered, his voice higher than normal. I couldn't answer him honestly. Despite my background in zoology, I had no explanation that made sense. "I'm not sure, honey," was all I could manage. Richard found his voice first. "Let's get back to camp," he said firmly, taking Mark's hand while I held onto Tommy. We didn't run. Somehow that felt dangerous, like it might trigger a chase response. But we walked quickly, constantly glancing over our shoulders. The walk back to our campsite took about 15 minutes, though it felt much longer. The boys kept asking questions that we couldn't answer. Was it a bear? Why did it walk like that? Why was it so big? When we reached our campsite, Richard immediately started packing up our gear while I tried to keep the boys occupied and calm. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, despite having been at this site for 2 days. About 10 feet up the trunk of a large Douglas fir at the edge of our site were deep gouges in the bark, 4 parallel lines that looked like claw marks. They were fresh. The exposed inner bark was still light-colored and oozing sap. But what made my stomach drop was their height. Even with Richard's reach, standing on tiptoes, he couldn't come close to touching them. Whatever had made those marks had to be extremely tall and powerful. "Richard," I called softly, not wanting to alarm the boys further. When he came over, I pointed to the marks. He stared at them for a long moment, then looked at me. "Those weren't there yesterday," he said quietly. "I'm sure of it. I hung the lantern from that lower branch last night." We finished packing in record time. The boys were still upset but seemed to calm down somewhat with the familiar routine of breaking camp. As we loaded the last of our gear into our station wagon, another couple pulled into a nearby site in a red pickup truck. Richard walked over to talk to them while I got the boys settled in the car. I could hear him asking casual questions, how long they planned to stay, if they'd been to this campground before. Then he mentioned trying to sound conversational. "We saw something strange on the loop trail earlier. Really big animal. Any idea what kind of wildlife is in these parts?" The man, probably in his 50s with a weathered face that suggested he knew the outdoors, looked at Richard curiously. "Bears sometimes, though they usually stay higher up. Elk, deer. Nothing that'd be unusual to see." Richard hesitated, then added, "This thing was walking on 2 legs. Tall, taller than me by a good bit. Dark brown fur all over." The man and woman exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. After a pause, the man said, "Couldn't have been a bear. No bear gets that big, and they don't walk on their hind legs for more than a few steps." He seemed about to say more, then glanced at his wife and shrugged. "Probably just saw something in bad light. Trees and shadows can play tricks on you." We left shortly after, driving perhaps faster than was safe on the winding gravel road back to the highway. The boys fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the excitement and fear. Richard and I barely spoke during the drive home, both lost in our thoughts. That evening, after we'd unpacked and the boys were in bed, we finally talked about what we'd seen. Richard suggested it might have been a man in some kind of costume, but that made no sense. We were miles from anywhere, and the movement and proportions were all wrong. I estimated the creature weighed between 500 and 800 pounds. It wasn't bloated or fat, but powerfully built, with muscle evident even under the fur. I called a colleague from the biology department the next day, carefully framing my questions about large mammals in the Pacific Northwest. He mentioned bears, elk, the occasional moose, but nothing that matched what we'd seen. When I pressed about reports of unusually large bipedal animals, he laughed and asked if I'd been reading tabloids. We didn't tell many people about our experience. Those we did tell either thought we were joking or suggested we'd misidentified a bear. But I know what bears look like, how they move. This was something else entirely. The boys had nightmares for weeks afterward. Tommy drew pictures of what he called the forest man, crude crayon drawings of an impossibly tall, dark figure among trees. Mark wouldn't sleep without his bedroom door open and a light on in the hallway. Richard and I returned to Howard's Creek the following summer, just the two of us, partly out of curiosity and partly to face our fears. We saw nothing unusual, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as we hiked some of the more remote trails. Over the years, I've read accounts of similar sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Some sound like tall tales, but others, the ones with specific details about the creature's gait, proportions and movement, send chills down my spine because they describe exactly what we saw. It's been over 45 years since that day, and I still don't have an explanation. All I know is that 4 people, 2 adults with scientific training and 2 children, saw something that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology. The creature moved with purpose and intelligence. It was aware of us, but chose to avoid confrontation. And it left marks high on a tree that no known animal in that region could have made. I still dream about it sometimes, that moment when it paused on the road and turned its head toward us. In my dreams, I can see its face more clearly, and there's something almost contemplative in its gaze, not the mindless look of an animal, but something else, something that haunts me to this day. Story 12. It's been nearly 30 years, but I still get a knot in my stomach every time I think about what happened that autumn day in Greene County. I moved to Virginia from Vermont back in '93 after getting laid off from my forestry job up north. Found a little cabin-style house on 3 acres, backing up to some seriously dense woods. Not exactly wilderness by Vermont standards, but wild enough to make me feel at home. I'd been an outdoorsman my whole life, grew up hunting with my dad, worked as a trail guide during college, even did some survival training with a buddy who was ex-military. So when I tell you something felt wrong that day, I'm not some city slicker jumping at shadows. It was early October, and I'd been in Virginia about 4 months. The Blue Ridge Mountains were just starting to show their fall colors, and I'd been exploring the area pretty regularly with Luna, my German shepherd. She was 4 years old then, smart as a whip and trained better than most kids these days. Luna never went more than 20 yards ahead without checking back on me, never chased animals without command, and always came when called. That particular afternoon, I decided to check out this little valley ravine I'd discovered about 2 miles from my property. There was an old stone bridge crossing a stream there, probably built in the 30s, and around it grew these wild apple trees with fruit that was this really deep green color, almost like jade. They looked tart but healthy, and I figured they'd be perfect for the little orchard I was planning to start. I brought a burlap sack that could hold about 50 pounds, figuring I'd collect enough for seeds and maybe make some cider with the rest. Luna was having a great time splashing in the stream while I picked apples, and everything was peaceful. Too peaceful, looking back on it. No birds, no squirrels chattering, just the sound of the water and Luna's occasional splashing. It was getting on towards evening when I finally filled my sack. The sun was still up, but the ravine was already cast in shadow, making it feel later than it was. I hoisted that bag over my shoulder, heavy sucker, but nothing I couldn't handle, and whistled for Luna to lead the way home. The trail back crossed through what I can only describe as the oldest part of those woods. The trees there were massive, oaks and hickories that must have been hundreds of years old. The path narrowed as it climbed up from the ravine, with a small mountain stream running parallel about 30 feet down slope. The canopy was so thick that even in daytime, you needed to watch your footing. We were about halfway up this incline when I felt it, that prickly sensation on the back of your neck when you're being watched. At first, I figured it was just a deer or maybe even a black bear. They're common enough in those parts, but this felt different, more focused somehow. I stopped to catch my breath, using it as an excuse to scan the trees around me. Luna had trotted about 15 feet ahead, but then stopped too, her ears perked forward, body completely still in that way hunting dogs get when they've caught a scent. Then I smelled it. Just the faintest whiff at first, like meat left too long in the sun mixed with something musky and wild. It made my stomach turn. Luna's head snapped to the left, looking uphill into a particularly dense thicket. I followed her gaze but couldn't see anything through the undergrowth. Then she was off like a shot, not barking, not making any noise at all, just charging full speed into the brush about 100 meters up the slope. "Luna!" I called after her, dropping my apple sack. "Luna, come!" Nothing, no response. This dog, who had never once ignored a command, was completely gone, vanished into the woods. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, calling her name repeatedly, that uneasy feeling growing stronger by the moment. Finally, I hefted my bag again and started moving in the direction she'd disappeared, still calling her name. The smell was getting stronger. God, it was awful, like roadkill and sewage and something else I couldn't identify. Something not right. I'd gone maybe 50 yards when I heard movement in the brush ahead. Heavy movement, like something big pushing through the undergrowth. But it didn't sound like a bear or deer. The rhythm was wrong. It sounded bipedal. I froze. Whatever it was stopped moving too. We stood there in mutual silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then I heard it move again, this time away from me, up the slope. The branches weren't just bending, they were breaking. Whatever this was had serious weight and strength. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. I've encountered black bears dozens of times and never felt that kind of fear. This was primal. Every instinct was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. Instead, I called for Luna again, my voice embarrassingly shaky. Still nothing. 5 minutes passed. I know because I kept checking my watch, wondering how long I should wait before I needed to go search for her. I was about to drop the apples and go looking when she finally emerged from the brush, trotting toward me as if nothing had happened. She wasn't acting frightened or aggressive, just excited like she'd been playing. But Luna didn't play when we were hiking. She was always alert, always working. This was completely out of character. I checked her over quickly. No injuries, no blood. But her muzzle and chest were wet, and not just from the stream. It was like she'd been drooling excessively, and she smelled like that same awful odor, but stronger now, as if she'd been rolling in it. "What did you find, girl?" I asked, knowing she couldn't tell me. She just wagged her tail and looked up at me with those eager brown eyes. I decided to get moving. The light was fading fast, and that feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. We continued up the path, and I noticed Luna kept looking back over her shoulder, not in fear, but almost like she was expecting something to follow. When we reached the crest of the hill, curiosity got the better of me. I set down my bag and went back about 20 yards to where Luna had disappeared. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. I scanned the ground for tracks, but found nothing clear, just broken vegetation and some disturbed earth. Whatever had been there was large enough to break inch-thick branches, but there were no distinct footprints, at least none that I could recognize. The only thing I found was a clump of hair caught on a bramble bush. It was dark brown or black, coarse, and about 6 inches long. Not bear fur, not deer hair. I picked it off and examined it, then stupidly put it in my pocket without thinking. By now the sun was setting in earnest, and I needed to get home. Luna and I made good time, but that sensation of being followed never quite disappeared. Every few minutes, she would stop and look behind us, ears forward, tail stiff. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I trusted her senses more than mine. We made it back to my place just as full darkness set in. I had 3 dogs at the time, Luna, plus 2 mixed-breed rescues named Buck and Sadie that stayed in a fenced yard while Luna came hiking with me. As soon as we approached the house, they started going crazy, barking and running along the fence line facing the woods. Luna, who was usually calm, started barking too, which set my nerves even more on edge. I quickly went inside, dumped the apples in my kitchen sink, and grabbed my shotgun. I'm not trigger happy, but something about the whole situation had me genuinely rattled. I let Luna in, turned on all the outside lights, and spent a good hour scanning the tree line with a flashlight. Nothing. Eventually the dogs calmed down, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. I cleaned up, had some dinner, and went to bed, though I kept waking up throughout the night thinking I heard something moving around outside. The next morning, I went out to plant some of those apple seeds in the garden plot I'd prepared near the edge of my property. All 3 dogs were with me, seemingly back to normal. I had dug about 5 small holes and was placing seeds when Luna's head suddenly snapped up. The other 2 dogs froze as well, all looking toward the woods. Then that smell hit me again, that same putrid, rotten odor from the ravine. It was fainter, but unmistakable. And it wasn't coming from the dogs or my clothes. It was coming from the woods, about 50 yards from where I was standing. The dogs went ballistic, not just barking, but howling, hackles raised, teeth bared. Even Luna, who was trained to stay calm, was losing it. But none of them would approach the tree line. They formed a line between me and the woods, barking at something I couldn't see. I backed toward the house, calling the dogs to follow. Buck and Sadie came right away, but Luna stood her ground, still barking at whatever was out there. It took 3 commands to get her to finally retreat with me to the porch. From the relative safety of my back steps, I scanned the woods with binoculars, but saw nothing unusual. After about 20 minutes, the smell dissipated, and the dogs eventually calmed down. That afternoon, I remembered the hair sample in my jacket pocket. I examined it more carefully in daylight, and still couldn't identify it. It wasn't human hair, too coarse and thick. It wasn't bear fur either. Something about it reminded me of pictures I'd seen of gorilla hair, but that was obviously impossible. Over the next few weeks, I experienced several more incidents. Unusual sounds at night, that same smell occasionally drifting across my property, the dogs becoming agitated for no apparent reason. I installed motion sensor lights and even set up a couple of trail cameras, but never caught anything conclusive on film. I also started asking locals about strange encounters in the woods. Most laughed it off, but a few old-timers got quiet and would change the subject. One elderly man at the hardware store just shook his head and told me to leave well enough alone. I haven't hiked in that ravine since. Call me superstitious, but I'm convinced whatever was out there was intelligent enough to follow my scent back to my property. It knew where I lived. It was curious about me. I've read about Bigfoot encounters over the years, and while I've always been skeptical, I can't explain what happened that day. All I know is it wasn't a bear, wasn't a deer, and wasn't anything else I could identify after 30 years of experience in the woods. Luna passed away 7 years after that incident, and I've had other dogs since, but none that ever reacted the way she did that day. Sometimes, even now, when I'm out in my yard at dusk, I get that same feeling of being watched from the tree line, and occasionally, when the wind is just right, I catch a whiff of that same putrid odor. Whatever it was, it changed me. I still hike, still hunt, still love the outdoors, but I never go alone anymore, always carry protection, and I'm always aware of what's around me. Because something was out there that day, something that shouldn't exist, and sometimes I think it's still watching. Story 13. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 20 years now. I'm not the type who goes around claiming to see weird stuff. I've worked construction most of my life, hunt regularly, and spend more time outdoors than most people. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I know what I saw that day in the summer of 2003, and it wasn't anything that should exist. My buddy Charlie to his friends and I, had this small gold claim in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains, near this place called Boulder Gulch. Nothing fancy. We weren't getting rich or anything close to it. Just a couple of middle-aged guys with metal detectors and panning equipment chasing a hobby that occasionally paid for itself. We'd been working this claim on and off for about 2 years, usually going up for a week or so at a time when we could both get away from our regular jobs. This particular trip started like any other. We drove up in Charlie's old Ford pickup, hauling our gear the last mile or so on foot to this clearing we always used as our campsite. It was perfect, flat ground for the tents, close to the creek where we did most of our panning, and just off an old mining trail that hardly anyone used anymore. The area was pretty remote, which is exactly how we liked it. That morning, Charlie headed down to the creek early. He was always more patient with the panning than me, could sit there for hours swirling that water around. I stayed back at camp organizing our equipment, setting up the new sluice box we'd bought, and taking inventory of our supplies. Normal stuff. I first noticed something was off around 10 in the morning. It was this feeling like someone was watching me. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know the difference between regular awareness and something unusual. This was unusual. I kept glancing up from what I was doing, scanning the trees, telling myself it was probably just a deer or maybe even a bear. We'd seen plenty of both over the years, but this felt different somehow, more deliberate. Throughout the day, the feeling would come and go. I'd be fine for half an hour, then suddenly get that crawling sensation again. By early afternoon, I was getting irritated with myself. I'm not some nervous city kid jumping at shadows. I've hunted elk in these mountains since I was 15. I've tracked mountain lions. Hell, I've faced down a grizzly once from about 30 yards. Don't recommend it. But something about this day had me on edge. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, I was standing by our gear pile, making a mental note of what we needed to restock before our next trip. Charlie was still down at the creek, maybe 150 yards away. I could just see the top of his hat occasionally when he moved around. That's when I saw it. About 100 feet uphill from our camp, just beyond where the clearing met the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a hiker. We occasionally ran into other people, though it was rare in this particular area. But as I focused on the movement, I realized instantly this was no hiker. Standing there, partially obscured by a pine tree but clearly visible, was a figure. That's the only word I can use that doesn't make me sound crazy. It was standing upright on two legs, and it was tall, really tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but hair, dark brown or black. I couldn't tell for sure in the shadows. The build was what got me. It was shaped like a person, but much bulkier. The shoulders were massive, easily twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks. They weren't. The thing that really struck me was how it was standing, perfectly upright, not hunched over like a bear when it stands. I've seen bears rear up plenty of times, and they don't stand like that. This thing had long arms hanging down by its sides, almost to its knees. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of seconds, we just looked at each other. I swear to God, it seemed just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. There was intelligence in those eyes. They were set deep under a heavy brow, dark-colored, and they were looking right at me, studying me. Then, without any hurry, it simply turned sideways and stepped behind the trees. It didn't crash through the underbrush or run away. It just left, deliberately, calmly. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. No sound, no broken branches, nothing. I don't know how long I stood there frozen. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't yell for Charlie. I didn't run. I just stood there trying to process what I'd just seen. Eventually, I made myself walk down to the creek. I needed to tell Charlie, but I was already anticipating the look on his face. We'd been friends for over 20 years, and I'd never seen anything like this before, never claimed to see anything strange, but I knew how it would sound. "Charlie," I said when I reached him, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to believe me." He must have heard something in my voice because he stopped what he was doing and looked up at me right away. I told him everything, exactly as I'd seen it. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss me outright. He just listened, his expression getting more serious as I described the details. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute, then said, "Remember yesterday, up on the ridge?" And that's when it all connected. The previous day, we'd hiked further up following an old logging road past some collapsed mining cabins, looking for signs of older diggings that might point to good deposit areas. About 2 miles in, we hit this smell. It was sudden and overwhelming, like a wet dog that had been rolling in garbage for weeks, musky and putrid at the same time. We both commented on it, figured maybe it was a dead animal nearby. The weird part was how the smell followed us. For about 10 minutes, that stench stayed with us as we walked, then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Later that same day, we checked out this old one-room cabin that was still standing, and the same exact smell hit us again, strong enough that Charlie actually gagged. Then, just like before, it disappeared completely when we left the area. "You think that smell and what I saw are connected?" I asked him. He shrugged. "I'm not saying it's but whatever you saw might have been near us yesterday too." We didn't say the word Bigfoot. It felt too ridiculous, too Hollywood. But we both knew what we were thinking. That night was the tensest camping experience of my life. We built the fire bigger than usual and took turns staying awake. Nothing happened. No sounds, no smells, no sightings. But I couldn't shake the feeling we were being observed from a distance. The next morning, we decided to check the area where I'd seen the figure. The ground was rocky and covered with pine needles, not great for tracks. But about 30 yards into the trees, we found a clear impression in a patch of softer soil. It was a footprint, sort of. Bigger than my boot by a lot, and shaped wrong for a bear. It had 5 distinct toe marks and was deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting whatever made it was heavy. We looked at each other but didn't say much. What was there to say? We took some measurements with Charlie's tape measure. The print was just over 15 inches long and about 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. Neither of us had a camera with us. We stayed 3 more days to finish our planned trip, but the enthusiasm was gone. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. We both jumped at sounds we would have ignored before. The gold panning seemed pointless compared to what might be watching us from the trees. On our last night, around 2 in the morning, we both woke up to the sound of something heavy moving around our campsite. Not sneaking, it was moving with purpose, investigating our equipment. Charlie grabbed his flashlight, but I put my hand on his arm and shook my head. Some instinct told me we didn't want to confront whatever was out there. We lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as something big circled our tents for almost 20 minutes before moving off into the forest. When first light came, we found our packs had been moved. Not torn open or damaged, just relocated from where we'd left them. A bag of trail mix was missing. The sluice box had been picked up and set down several feet away. We packed up faster than we ever had before and hiked out without speaking much. On the drive home, Charlie finally broke the silence. "You know nobody's going to believe this, right?" I nodded. "I know. I'm not sure I believe it myself, and I saw the damn thing. Charlie passed away from lung cancer 8 years ago. Before he died, we talked about that trip one last time. He admitted that while he hadn't seen what I saw, he'd never doubted me for a second. He said the sounds that last night and the footprint were enough for him. I've been back to the Bighorns many times since then, but never to that specific area. I've told this story exactly 3 times, once to my wife, once to Charlie's son after the funeral, and now here. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most days, I try to convince myself there must be some rational explanation. But then I remember those eyes looking at me, the intelligence in them, the way it moved, not like an animal, but like something that knew exactly what it was doing. And I know what I saw. I won't use the B word. I don't need to label it. But something was in those mountains watching us. Something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human. Something smart enough to investigate our camp without threatening us. Something curious. And the really unsettling thought, the one that still keeps me up sometimes. It's probably still up there, watching other hikers and campers who have no idea they're being observed. Story 14. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. Not because I didn't think people would believe me, I don't really care about that, but because every time I think about it, my hands start shaking and I get this cold feeling in my stomach. But it's been almost 50 years now, and I think it's time I wrote it down. It was August 3rd, 1976. I remember because it was my day off from the auto shop where I worked, and I'd spent most of the day helping my neighbor fix his Chevy Nova. Back then, I lived in a small house in the foothills just outside of Bel Air, not in the fancy part, but close enough that I'd occasionally see a celebrity at the local grocery store. That night, I was sitting on my back porch with a beer, enjoying the warm summer air. It was about 11:15, and I was just thinking about heading to bed when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a plane on fire or something. This massive ball of orange-yellow light streaked across the sky, way bigger and brighter than any shooting star I'd ever seen. It wasn't just a flash either. It moved slowly enough that I had time to stand up and track it with my eyes as it arced over Los Angeles and disappeared behind the hills about a mile from my place. The weirdest thing was the color. It wasn't just orange. It had this pulsing blue-green halo around it that made my eyes hurt to look at. And there was no sound, which struck me as wrong somehow. Something that big and that bright falling from the sky should have made noise, right? I remember standing there for a few minutes, wondering if I should call someone. But who do you call when you see something fall from the sky? I figured if it was something serious, we'd hear sirens soon enough. I went inside, locked up, and tried to sleep, but I kept seeing that fireball behind my eyelids. Around midnight, I finally dozed off, only to be jolted awake by my phone ringing. It was Mrs. Abernathy, this widow who lived about half a mile up the road. She was in her 60s, lived alone, and would sometimes call me if she needed help with something around her house. "They're in my yard," she whispered. Her voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand her. "What? Who's in your yard?" I asked, still half asleep. "I don't know what they are," she said. "They're digging holes. They look like gorillas or something. Please come." Now, Mrs. Abernathy wasn't the type to make stuff up. She was a retired school teacher, practical and no nonsense. If she said something was in her yard, something was in her yard. I told her to call the police right away, and I'd be there in 10 minutes. I threw on some clothes, grabbed a flashlight and my baseball bat, and jumped in my truck. The whole way there, I was telling myself it was probably raccoons or maybe a bear that had wandered down from the mountains. But deep down, I kept thinking about that fireball. When I pulled up to Mrs. Abernathy's house, 2 police cruisers were already there, lights flashing but no sirens. Another car pulled up right behind me. It was Dave Parker, another neighbor who lived across the street from Mrs. Abernathy. "You see that thing in the sky earlier?" Dave asked as we got out of our cars. I nodded. "You think it's connected to whatever's going on here?" Before Dave could answer, we heard a crash from the backyard, followed by shouting. Not human shouting, it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A high-pitched wailing that went up and down in pitch, almost like someone trying to form words but not knowing how. We ran around to the back of the house, where Mrs. Abernathy was standing on her back porch with a police officer. The cop was shining his flashlight into the yard, and his other hand was on his gun. "Stay back," he told us firmly. "We've got a situation here." That's when I saw them. There were 3 of them moving around the yard. They were about the size of a tall man, maybe 6 feet or a bit more, but they weren't men. Their bodies were covered in dark, matted hair, and they moved in this jerky, unnatural way, like their joints bent in directions they shouldn't. They had arms that hung down past their knees, and these massive hands with long fingers. One of them was digging furiously in Mrs. Abernathy's vegetable garden, tearing up her tomato plants and throwing dirt everywhere. Another was by the fence, seeming to examine it, running those long fingers over the wood. The third one was the closest to us, and as the cop's flashlight beam hit it, it turned and looked right at us. Its face, God, I still see that face in my nightmares. It was flat and wide, with a small nose that was almost flush with its face, and a mouth that seemed too big, stretching from ear to ear. But it was the eyes that got me. They were huge and round, reflecting the flashlight like a cat's eyes, but they were this pale, milky blue color that seemed to glow from within. For a second, we all just stood there, frozen. Then the creature by the fence let out another one of those wailing sounds, and all hell broke loose. The one closest to us charged at the porch. The cop fired a warning shot into the air, which seemed to startle it for a moment, but then it grabbed a branch that had fallen from one of Mrs. Abernathy's oak trees. This thing was at least 4 feet long and thick as my arm, and hurled it straight at us. It hit the porch railing with such force that it splintered the wood and nearly hit Mrs. Abernathy. The cop started shouting into his radio, calling for backup, saying something about hostile individuals, though I don't think he knew what to call them either. Dave pulled Mrs. Abernathy inside while I stood there, still clutching my baseball bat like an idiot, as if that would do anything against these things. More branches started flying at the house. One smashed through a window. The creatures were making those awful sounds non-stop now, a cacophony of screeches and wails that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just random noise. There was a pattern to it, like they were communicating with each other. Within minutes, more police cars arrived, their headlights illuminating the yard in harsh white light. The creatures didn't run away like animals would. Instead, they became more agitated, more aggressive. They started picking up rocks, sticks, anything they could throw. One officer got hit in the shoulder and went down hard. "Get inside! Everyone get inside!" someone shouted, and I didn't need to be told twice. Dave, Mrs. Abernathy and I huddled in her living room with 2 cops while the others tried to contain whatever was happening outside. Through the window, I could see more police arriving. One had a shotgun. There was shouting, more of those inhuman wails, the sound of things breaking. Then a different sound cut through it all, a high-pitched humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It made my teeth hurt and my ears ring. The creatures reacted immediately. They all stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky, then at each other. Then, as if responding to some signal we couldn't perceive, they all ran toward the back of the property where Mrs. Abernathy's yard bordered on a steep, wooded hill. The police gave chase, but those things moved fast, faster than seemed possible for something their size. They disappeared into the trees before anyone could stop them. For the next few hours, Mrs. Abernathy's house became a hub of police activity. More officers arrived, then some guys in suits who didn't introduce themselves but asked a lot of questions. They seemed particularly interested in the fireball I'd seen and exactly where I thought it had come down. They took statements from all of us, and one of the suit guys pulled me aside. "What you saw tonight, it would be better if you didn't discuss it widely," he said, not in a threatening way, but in this calm, reasonable tone that somehow made it worse. "There's going to be an official explanation released tomorrow. Equipment from Edwards Air Force Base, experimental parachute tests, some local kids playing a prank, you understand?" I nodded, but I didn't understand. Not then, and not now. By dawn, they'd cordoned off the entire neighborhood. Nobody in or out without ID. They brought in dogs to try to track the creatures, but the dogs wouldn't go near the spots where they'd been digging. They just whined and pulled at their leashes, trying to get away. Those holes they dug, they weren't random. They formed a perfect triangle in Mrs. Abernathy's yard, each hole about 3 feet deep and 2 feet across. At the bottom of each hole was a small depression, perfectly round, like something had been removed. The soil at the bottom was scorched, as if whatever had been there was hot enough to burn the earth around it. By noon the next day, the official story was already being reported on local news. A weather balloon had burst in the atmosphere, causing the light people saw. The gorillas were just local teenagers in costumes pulling a prank that got out of hand. The holes in Mrs. Abernathy's yard were blamed on wild animals. Some people bought it. Most didn't, but after a few days, with no more sightings and no evidence except some holes and broken branches, people moved on. Life went back to normal, except it didn't. Not really. Not for those of us who were there. Mrs. Abernathy sold her house 3 months later and moved to Arizona to live with her daughter. Dave Parker became obsessed with UFOs and cryptids, covering his walls with newspaper clippings and blurry photos. He lost his job, Then his house. Last I heard, he was living in a trailer somewhere in Nevada. As for me, I stayed. I kept working at the auto shop. I got married, had kids, got divorced. Normal life stuff. But I never go hiking in those hills. I never stay outside after dark if I can help it. And I always look up at the night sky, watching for lights that move the wrong way. It's been almost 50 years, and I still don't know what happened that night. Were they aliens? Some unknown species of animal? Something else entirely? All I know is what I saw, and what I saw doesn't fit into the world as I understood it before that night. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, those creatures, living in the hills around Los Angeles. Sometimes I wonder what they took from those holes, and why they needed it. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I swear I can hear that wailing sound, distant but unmistakable, drifting down from the hills. Story 15. I've debated for years whether to share this, but I need to get it off my chest. What happened to me and my little cousin back in November of 2012 still keeps me up some nights, and the follow-up encounter a year later only confirmed what I already knew. There's something out there in those woods that shouldn't exist. My family owns about 80 acres of woodland outside of Oakville, Washington. It's mostly timber, with some old cattle trails cutting through it from when my grandfather ran livestock there in the 70s. We've always used the land for hunting, mainly deer, and I've been going out there since I was a kid myself. That day started like any other pre-season scouting trip. It was mid-November, maybe 2 weeks before deer season opened. The weather was typical for Western Washington that time of year. Damp, chilly, overcast, but not pouring rain. My cousin Tommy was visiting from Portland. He was 12 at the time and excited to go exploring on the property, so I figured I'd take him out on the ATV to scout some potential spots for hunting blinds while showing him around. We loaded up my Honda Foreman around 3 in the afternoon. It wasn't a big machine, just a single-seat four-wheeler with a small rack on the back where Tommy sat holding on to me. I brought my rifle along. Just a habit, really. You never know when you might run into coyotes or see a buck worth remembering for opening day. The property has these rolling hills with pretty dense forest of Douglas fir and cedar, broken up by some small clearings where old timber had been selectively harvested decades back. We followed the main cattle trail that winds up through the back section, stopping occasionally to check out promising spots. Tommy was having a blast, pointing out deer sign and asking a million questions about hunting. Time got away from us. Before I knew it, the light was starting to fade. In November, darkness comes early in Washington, and by 5:30, it was already getting pretty dim under the tree canopy. I told Tommy we should head back to the house, which was about 2 miles away on the north edge of the property. We were slowly climbing a rutted section of the trail, maybe doing 10 miles per hour at most, when I first heard it. At first I thought it was just the ATV engine echoing off the trees, or maybe the sound of the tires in the mud. But then Tommy tensed up behind me. "What's that noise?" he asked, his voice already shaking. That's when I really focused on it, a heavy, rhythmic pounding coming from behind us. It wasn't an echo. Something was following us. I glanced back over my shoulder, and what I saw still doesn't make sense to this day. No more than 10 feet behind the ATV was this thing. I can't call it an animal. I mean, I've hunted these woods my entire life. I know what bears look like, what cougars look like. This wasn't that. It was huge, like impossibly tall. I'm 6'1", and this thing would have towered over me by at least 4 feet. It was covered in dark brown hair, thick and matted in places. The body was shaped vaguely like a human, but massively built across the chest and shoulders. Its arms were long, unnaturally long, and they swung as it ran. The thing that really got me was its face. Its head sat low on its shoulders, almost like it didn't have a neck. The eyes faced forward, not on the sides like a deer or typical prey animal. They were dark, intelligent, and locked right on us. Its nose was flat, almost pushed in. Tommy screamed, and I gunned the engine. The trail was still climbing uphill, so we couldn't go much faster. The creature stayed right behind us, those massive legs eating up the ground in huge strides. I could actually hear it breathing, deep, powerful breaths that didn't seem labored at all, like keeping pace with a four-wheeler was nothing. "Hold on tight!" I yelled to Tommy, who had his arms wrapped around me in a death grip. I could feel him shaking. After what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, we crested the hill and hit a flat, open field. I opened the throttle all the way, pushing the ATV to about 30 miles per hour across the bumpy ground. I expected the thing to give up once we hit speed, but when I looked back, it was still coming. It had fallen back a bit, maybe 30 yards now, but it was running with this bizarre, fluid motion, covering ground faster than anything that size should be able to move. The distance to the house seemed infinite. We had to cross this field, then hit the dirt access road that led to the main property where the house stood. I kept the throttle wide open, praying we wouldn't hit a hole or rock that would flip us. As we approached the edge of the field, where the dirt road began, I heard a whooshing sound past my right ear. I ducked instinctively, and something heavy thudded into the ground ahead of us. When we drove past it, I realized with horror that it was a chunk of wood, a small log about 3 feet long and maybe 6 inches around. It had thrown it at us. Not randomly. It had deliberately picked up that log and hurled it like a spear. Tommy was crying now, his face buried against my back. I didn't blame him. I was terrified myself, my hands shaking on the handlebars as we finally hit the dirt road. I looked back one more time and saw the creature standing at the tree line, watching us. It made no attempt to follow onto the more open road. It just stood there, this massive silhouette against the darkening forest. We made it back to the house, and I practically carried Tommy inside. My uncle, who was visiting with Tommy's family, immediately knew something was wrong. I tried to explain what we'd seen, but I could tell from their faces they thought we'd just spooked ourselves in the fading light. They suggested it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs. But I know bears. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't chase ATVs at 30 miles per hour. They don't throw logs with accuracy. And they don't have eyes that look at you with what I can only describe as calculated intelligence. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise outside had me jumping. I kept replaying the image of that thing running behind us, imagining what would have happened if the ATV had stalled or tipped over. The next morning, I convinced my dad to drive back out with me to the spot where we'd seen it. I didn't tell him exactly what I was looking for, just that I wanted to check something out. There were some unusual tracks in the soft ground, much larger than a human footprint, with what looked like 5 toes, but wider and deeper than anything I'd seen before. My dad dismissed them as probably elk, but elk don't have 5-toed prints. The disturbing thing was finding several deer carcasses in the area over the next few days. They weren't shot or killed by predators in any normal way. The limbs were completely torn off, not chewed or cut, just ripped apart, like something with incredible strength had dismembered them. I didn't go back to that part of the property for the rest of that year. I made excuses about preferring other hunting spots, and nobody questioned it. Tommy refused to go anywhere near the woods again during his visit. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. November 2013, almost exactly a year later, I finally worked up the courage to go back to set up a hunting blind for the upcoming season. I went alone this time, in broad daylight, carrying my rifle. I told myself I'd been imagining things, that it was just a bear, that the stress and fading light had made me see something that wasn't there. I was about half a mile from where we'd had the encounter the year before, setting up a small platform blind in a tree overlooking a game trail. At one point, I took out my binoculars to scan the area for deer sign. That's when I saw it again. About 80 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive cedar tree, was a broadhead with dark grey hair, slightly lighter than what I remembered from the year before. It was just watching me, not moving, just observing from behind the tree. When I reached for my binoculars for a better look, it disappeared, just gone, with barely a sound. I abandoned the blind setup and cautiously made my way over to where I'd seen it. Behind the tree was a narrow creek with steep banks, perfect for concealment. The ground was disturbed, with broken branches and what looked like the same five-toed prints, only these were even deeper in the mud. Over the next few days of hunting season, I found more mutilated deer in the same area. One had been literally torn in half. No bullet wounds, no arrow injuries, just destroyed by something with tremendous strength. The strangest part was that nothing had fed on them much. Whatever killed them didn't do it primarily for food. I've researched everything I can find about similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. I know what people call these things, but I'm hesitant to use that name because it comes with so much ridicule. All I know is what I saw. A massive, powerful, intelligent creature that doesn't match any known animal. I still hunt on our property, but never alone, and never in that section. I've installed trail cameras in various locations, but they either get damaged or show nothing unusual. It's like this thing knows what they are and avoids them. To this day, I can't explain what chased us through those woods, but I know it was real, I know it was dangerous, and I know it's still out there. Story 16. I've spent over 3 decades trying to make sense of what happened to me that day. I've never been much of a writer, but I need to get this off my chest. I've only told a few close friends over the years, and most of them gave me that look. You know the one, like I'd completely lost my mind. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. All I know is what I saw, and it changed me forever. It was Wednesday, May 17th, 1989. I remember the date clearly because I'd taken the day off work to celebrate finishing a big project. The weather was perfect, not too hot with a slight breeze, ideal for hiking. I'd been feeling cooped up in my apartment, and the mountains were calling me. I drove up to the top of Lake Street in Pasadena around 2 in the afternoon. There's an old estate up there, the Cobb Estate, that serves as a gateway to the mountains. I parked my car, grabbed my small backpack with water and some snacks, and set off. I wasn't planning anything ambitious, just a few hours of solitude and fresh air. The trails there branch off in different directions. I took the path that winds through the woods and eventually opens up to an area with electrical towers. I'd been there a handful of times before and loved the views of the city below. The hike was peaceful. I passed maybe 2 other people early on, but once I got deeper into the trails, I was completely alone. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a spot I particularly enjoyed. It was at the end of a narrow trail with ridges on either side and a rock face behind me. I could see Lake Street far below and the grid of Pasadena spreading out into the distance. The power lines hummed softly overhead. It was absolutely quiet, except for the occasional bird and that strange, distant chopping sound that echoed through the mountains. I figured it was construction work somewhere down in the city. I sat on a flat rock, ate an apple, and just breathed in the moment. No deadlines, no phones ringing, no people demanding my attention, just me and nature. I must have sat there for about 30 minutes, just thinking and decompressing. Around 4 o'clock, I decided I should start heading back down. The sun wasn't setting yet, but I didn't want to risk hiking in the dark. I gathered my things, took one last look at the view, and started back down the trail. The path eventually came to a T intersection where I needed to turn left to head back toward my car. As I made the turn, something moved in my peripheral vision. It was just a flash of movement, but enough to catch my attention. I stopped and turned to look down the path I'd just traveled. What I saw next makes my heart race even now as I type this. About 50 feet away was something, someone, a figure, but not human, at least not entirely. It was moving in the strangest way, almost like it was dancing or skipping, leaping from one side of the path to the other. It was completely covered in black hair or fur, standing maybe 6 feet tall, but hunched over slightly. My first thought wasn't fear, oddly enough. It was pure, unadulterated curiosity. In that moment, I did something that people tell me was incredibly stupid. I moved toward it. I didn't run, but I walked purposefully in its direction, wanting to see it more clearly. The moment it noticed me approaching, it froze for a second, then darted off the path down the bushy ridge to my right. It moved with incredible agility, considering the steep terrain and thick underbrush. Without thinking, I called out, "It's okay, come back," like I was calling to a scared dog or something. Then I backed up to where I'd been standing before, giving it space. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from excitement, adrenaline, and disbelief at what I was seeing. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, to my absolute amazement, it reappeared. It came back onto the path at exactly the same spot where it had left, as if it had circled around through the bushes. This time, it stood still, and I got my first good look at it. It was definitely not a person in a costume. The proportions were wrong. Longer arms, shorter neck, broader shoulders than a human. The black hair or fur covered its entire body, and though I couldn't make out facial features clearly from that distance, I could tell it was looking directly at me. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It seemed curious, maybe even cautious. We stood there, staring at each other across the distance. I was afraid to move, afraid to scare it away again. My mind was racing, trying to catalogue every detail, knowing no one would believe me later. The silence between us was electric. I remember the breeze stopping completely during those moments, like the whole world was holding its breath. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, I realized I needed to continue my descent before it got dark. I didn't want to turn my back on whatever this was. But I also didn't want to be stuck on the mountain after sunset. I don't know what compelled me to do what I did next. Maybe I wanted to communicate somehow, to acknowledge that this was a moment of connection between two intelligent beings. I slowly raised my right arm to its full length above my head and waved in a deliberate, sweeping gesture. Not a frantic wave, but a slow, intentional motion. What happened next sent chills through my entire body. The creature, and I'm just going to say it, the Bigfoot, turned slightly toward the fire road visible to its right. Then, with precision that still haunts me, it perfectly mimicked my gesture. It raised its arm and waved in exactly the same manner I had, the movement a mirror image of my own. It wasn't mocking me, it wasn't threatening me, it was communicating. After completing the wave, it simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees beside the fire road. As it left, I heard that strange chopping sound again, louder this time, coming from the direction it had gone. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, but not quite like any machinery I'd heard before. I stood frozen for several minutes after it disappeared, processing what had just happened. Part of me wanted to follow it, to see where it went, but common sense finally kicked in. I was alone on a mountain, the sun was getting lower, and I had just encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist. The hike back to my car was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, partly hoping to see it again, partly terrified I would. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Was it a person in a costume playing a prank? No, the movements were too fluid, too natural. A bear? Definitely not. Some other animal? Nothing else matches what I saw. When I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trailhead, half expecting to see the creature emerge from the woods. I drove home in a daze and immediately tried to write down everything I could remember: the height, the build, the way it moved, the perfect mimicry of my wave. I drew crude sketches that didn't do it justice. I searched my memory for any detail I might have missed. In the days that followed, I went to the library, no internet back then, and researched Bigfoot sightings. I found reports from all over, but very few from Southern California, and none that described the kind of peaceful interaction I'd experienced. Most accounts were frightening, people being chased or threatened. Mine wasn't like that at all. It felt more like an encounter between two curious beings, neither quite understanding the other, but both acknowledging the other's existence. I went back to that same trail several times over the next few months, hoping for another glimpse, but never saw anything unusual again. I even tried waving at empty sections of forest, feeling ridiculous but desperate for confirmation that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I've thought about reporting it officially, but what would I say? That I had a friendly wave-off with Bigfoot above Pasadena, that it danced down a trail and seemed more curious than dangerous. Who would believe that? So I've kept it mostly to myself for all these years. Sometimes I convince myself it was a hallucination or that my mind played tricks on me. But then I remember the details, the way the sun glinted off its dark fur, the proportions of its body that were just slightly wrong for a human, the perfect, deliberate mimicry of my wave. I don't know what I encountered that day. I don't know if it was truly what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. All I know is that for a few minutes on a mountain trail above Pasadena in 1989, I stood face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something intelligent, something that for a brief moment communicated with me in the simplest way possible. That chopping sound still bothers me, though. I've never been able to identify it or figure out its connection to what I saw. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear it again, distant but distinct, like it's calling me back to the mountains. Whatever it was, whatever I saw, I know this. It was real, and it's out there still, moving through forests where people rarely go, watching us as we unknowingly pass by. Maybe someday I'll see it again. Maybe someday someone will believe me.